Chapter 6:16. Guyu was stunned for a moment, then said, I did notice it, but I couldn't immediately determine that it had something to do with Fyunji. I just felt that it was different from an ordinary earthquake. As he spoke, he glanced at perfected Lord Guangbo with a complicated look in his eyes. Brother Guangbo, how can you be so sure that it has something to do with Tianlan? Perfected Lord Guangbo said proudly, what's so difficult about that? It's just a trick I set up earlier. Not only did the earthquake have something to do with Tianlan, but I can also determine that it happened at the underground entrance in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City. Someone saw it with their own eyes. Guyu's eyes flickered, but his expression didn't change. He nodded and said, Brother Guangbo, you're really good. I admire you. But since you can determine the location and range, I wonder if Brother Guangbo can tell me what exactly happened. Perfected Lord Guangbo laughed dryly, then shrugged and said, I'm not sure about that. Old man Tianlan sent a group of his most trusted men to watch the underground entrance. Other than his trusted men from Fyunji, no one else can enter the underground. So until now, we still don't know what he's doing there. Guyu replied with an, oh, and looked thoughtful. Perfected Lord Guangbo looked at him and suddenly smiled. There seemed to be a deeper meaning in his eyes. He said, Brother Guyu, if I remember correctly, that place has been forcefully occupied by Fyunji and people from other halls are not allowed to enter. But before that, Tianlan seemed to have invited you down and asked you to lead many people from Starry Hall to work in the underground city for a while. Am I right? Guyu frowned and nodded after a while. That's true. Brother Guangbo, what do you want to know? Perfected Lord Guangbo said, other than Fyunji's people, Brother Guangbo is the one who knows the most about the situation in the underground cave. Brother, please tell me, what secrets are there? And why did Tianlan ask you to go there? What did he ask you to do? He smiled, but there was no joy in his smile. Instead, there was a sense of scrutiny. He said, in addition, do you know what Tianlan did underground? Guyu Perfected Lord pondered for a moment, then said frankly, there is nothing that cannot be said, since Brother Guangbo has asked, I will tell you the truth. The underground cavern is extremely deep and vast, and there's a city hidden there. Although the houses and pavilions are similar to the buildings in the human world, they're much larger in size. It doesn't look like a place where ordinary people live. At this point, Guyu True Monarch's voice gradually became softer, showing signs of hesitation on her face. Perfected Lord Guangbo asked hurriedly, what exactly is it? Did you guys find out? Supreme Guyu shook her head and said, we can't find out, but when I was chatting with Tianlan in the underground city that day, I heard him say that he guessed that it might be the underground city of the demon clan in the past. Devil race. Perfected Lord Guangbo suddenly gasped. Obviously, with his status, he knew some secrets of the past. But soon, his expression returned to normal. Obviously, he thought that this matter shouldn't be a big deal. Otherwise, Tianlan and Guyu wouldn't be so calm. It was probably a well-preserved relic or ruin. Perfected Lord Guangbo thought so, but he didn't take this matter to heart. Perhaps he didn't expect that there were actually some lunatics in this world that he didn't expect. Lunatics or geniuses? Sometimes, it was just a fine line. Perfected Lord Guangbo threw the irrelevant matters of the demon clan to the back of his mind, and asked Guyu True Monarch what he was more concerned about, why did Tianlan ask you to go underground? Guyu True Monarch said, you know, there is an ancient relic under the Immortal City that was sealed by our Zhengxianmeng Patriarch. After the earthquake a few days ago, the seal was slightly damaged, and it was in the underground cave, so Tianlan asked me to repair it. He smiled and said, you know, our Starry Hall used to do this kind of thing. Perfected Lord Guangbo nodded slowly, agreeing with this statement. After frowning and thinking for a while, he asked again, if that's the case, in Brother Guyu's opinion, what happened underground not long ago? Could it be that Tianlan did something down there? Guyu True Monarch was silent for a moment, then said, I really don't know. You know, there was some discord between me and Tianlan a few days ago. Starry Hall and Floating Cloud also had a dispute, and the Starry Hall disciples who were originally stationed there were also withdrawn. I haven't been there for a long time. Perfected Lord Guangbo replied with a and rolled his eyes. Suddenly, he said, Brother Gu Yu, I have a presumptuous request. Please don't take offense. Gu Yu True Monarch's heart skipped a beat, and he said, Please say it. Perfected Lord Guangbo said, I still need to trouble you to make a trip down there, in the name of repairing or re-examining the seal, to see what happened underground. With your identity and this excuse, I don't think those people in Fuyunji would dare to stop you. Suddenly, a strange expression flashed across Perfected Lord Guangbo's face, and he looked at Perfected Lord Guangbo. Perfected Lord Guangbo sighed, stood up, and cupped his hands. He said, This is an important matter, and we have to be cautious. Although this matter will affect Brother Gu Yu's reputation, for the sake of our alliance, please make a trip. It's best if there are no more accidents. Perfected Lord Guangbo stared at him for a long time, and in the end, he suddenly smiled bitterly, and there seemed to be an indescribable expression on his face. In the end, he nodded and said, I understand. Since Brother Guangbo has said so, I won't refuse. I'll make this trip. Perfected Lord Guangbo was overjoyed, and said with a smile, Thank you, thank you. After coming out of the underground city, the people in Fuyunji quickly dispersed. After Shuang asked for Perfected Lord Tianlan's instructions, she also left with her people. Although it seemed that they had made a wasted trip, no one had any complaints. Everyone knew that Perfected Lord Tianlan must be doing something extremely important. What kind of big event could it be? No one in Fuyunji, including Shuang, asked any questions. If Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't say anything, it meant that they didn't need to know. After so many years, they were already used to this. However, there was another person in the crowd who wasn't so numb. He was full of doubts and curiosity about what happened when Perfected Lord Tianlan was alone underground. He really wanted to know what had happened. He was Lu Qin. Actually, when he walked into the main hall of Kunlun, Lu Qin also had some doubts. He didn't understand the unusually strong emotional impulse he had this time, but no matter what, he still wanted to ask that damn Baldy what had happened in that light. After all, he and Tianlan came here together, so he felt that he should know something. When he walked into the hall, he saw Perfected Lord Tianlan sitting on his lotus throne, which was rarely seen. Even from such a distance, he could feel that the person on the throne was staring at him with bright eyes, as if waiting for something. Chapter 617. Perfected Lord Tianlan watched as Lu Qin walked in. He did not say anything, nor did he say anything. He just sat quietly on the lotus throne. He wasn't sitting in an upright and dignified manner. Instead, he was sitting in a very casual and comfortable manner. He even put one hand on his knee and supported his chin with his palm. He looked at Lu Qin with a glimmer in his eyes, as if he was hiding some complicated emotions. Lu Qin could not understand what this person was thinking. He only felt that the damn Baldy today seemed to be a little different from usual. Was it because of what happened in the underground cavern? He walked to the lotus throne and stopped. Just as he was thinking about how to ask, he heard Perfected Lord Tianlan's voice coming from the high lotus throne. Do you have something to say to me? Lu Qin looked up at the throne uncomfortably. Usually, when they met or were alone, Perfected Lord Tianlan was very close and kind to him. He almost never sat on the high lotus throne to talk to him. He would either stand with him or casually sit on the ground. But this time, with the high lotus throne between them, it was as if there was a chasm between the two of them. They became a little estranged. Lu Qin did not know if Perfected Lord Tianlan did this on purpose or if he was just sitting casually and did not think too much. But this way of speaking still made him feel a little depressed and unhappy. However, when this thought flashed through his mind, Lu Qin was suddenly shocked. At that moment, he suddenly reflected on himself. Given Perfected Lord Tianlan's current power, status, and supreme reputation, he could actually sit on the lotus throne in front of most people in the world. Everyone would also think that it was only right. But why why did he feel that it was unfair? It was because for a long time, he had unknowingly gotten used to Perfected Lord Tianlan's special treatment of him. Unknowingly, he had already taken Perfected Lord Tianlan's special treatment for granted. However, if some things were seen through, a cold, naked truth would still be revealed from his dazzling appearance. Up until now, everything Lu Chen had, status, power, wealth, and so on, was actually all because of this man he called Damn Baldy. Without Perfected Lord Tianlan, who would acknowledge a shadow like him? Shuang. Or Fuyunji's arrogant soldiers and valiant generals. He had always prided himself on being calm, but he had unknowingly stepped on the edge of a cliff. Lu Chen stood there quietly. Under his clothes, he was covered in cold sweat. Perfected Lord Tianlan was still sitting on the throne on the high platform. He rested his chin on his hand and stared at Lu Chen. There was no anger on his face, but there seemed to be a playful look in his eyes. Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to have a unique patience for this disciple of his, which was different from others. But in the depths of his eyes, who would know what he was thinking? Would lightning suddenly descend from the sky? Under his gaze, Lu Chen seemed to be in a trance for a moment when he walked into the hall and stood under the lotus throne, but he soon recovered. He first looked up at Perfected Lord Tianlan and then asked, "Are you all right?" "Me?" Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't seem to expect that Lu Chen would ask such a question, so he was stunned for a moment. Then, he shook his head and laughed. "What could happen to me?" Lu Chen said, "No matter what, you're going there with me. Later, you asked me to call someone. After I left, I didn't know what happened in the underground city. I only saw the scene of you rising at the end. So, I thought that regardless of whether you want to tell me what happened or not, I still have to come and ask if you're all right." Perfected Lord Tianlan raised his eyebrows and was a little surprised, so much so that he fell silent for a moment. Then, his body moved slightly and his unusually tall and burly body suddenly disappeared from the lotus throne. In the next moment, he appeared on the ground like a ghost, standing not far from Lu Chen. Lu Chen looked up at him with a calm expression. However, his hands subconsciously clenched a little tighter under his sleeves. Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at Lu Chen for a moment and said with a smile, "I almost thought that I heard wrongly just now. It seems like you're actually showing concern for me. I've never seen you like this before. What's wrong with you today?" Lu Chen thought for a moment and said, "No matter what, I've bowed to you and acknowledged you as my master. You were the one who raised me since I was young. So, after thinking about it these days, I feel that I should be more respectful to you." Ha! Perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be especially surprised and could not help but laugh. His eyes flickered as he said to Lu Chen with a smile, "I'm surprised that you would think that way. I thought that you would only call me a damn baldy in your heart and still have some resentment towards me." Lu Chen fell silent and did not say anything. Perfected Lord Tianlan chuckled. When he realized that he did not get a response from Lu Chen, his expression changed slightly and he quietened down as well. The surrounding atmosphere instantly turned from relaxed to somewhat solemn. He frowned and looked at Lu Chen with some changes in his expression. There seemed to be some joy and some fear. After a while, Lu Chen said slowly, "After the Battle of the Barren Valley, I stayed in Qingshitang village for 10 years. I suffered a lot during that time. I'm sure you know how I was, right?" Perfected Lord Tianlan replied with a and placed his hands behind his back. He looked at Lu Chen and waited for him to continue. Lu Chen did not make him wait for too long and said with an extremely calm expression, "Those years were torturous for me and I was hovering between life and death every day. Since I didn't see you coming over, I naturally had some resentment towards you. It's just that after so many years, I gradually understood why you had no choice back then." At this point, he suddenly frowned and stopped talking as a look of displeasure flashed across his face. Perfected Lord Tianlan was listening attentively. He could not help but feel a little surprised when he suddenly stopped and even had a change in expression. "What else? Why did you stop?" However, Lu Chen seemed to be a little annoyed all of a sudden and turned hostile. No, he rolled his eyes and said angrily while waving his hand, say my A*s. I'm not going to say any more. This is the kind of person I am. You can do whatever you want. In any case, you can do whatever you want. Are you alright? If not, I'm leaving. After being contradicted by Lu Chen, perfected Lord Tianlan did not know why, but when he looked at Lu Chen's expression, his gaze softened a little as if he recalled the feeling of holding the small hand of the child whom he had just taken away from him many years ago. He smiled as if the entire world had become gentle at this moment. He nodded and was not at all offended by Lu Chen's somewhat angry expression. He said with a smile, I'm fine, I'm fine. He walked over and patted Lu Chen's shoulder. He said with a smile, actually, I just did a small thing down there. I just killed a person. It's not worth mentioning. Lu Chen's body shook and he said in astonishment, killed someone? There's actually someone else in the city down there. Who is it? Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, the remnant of the devil cult called Elder Ghost. As he spoke, he waved his hand as if he was shaking off an annoying dust and did not care at all. Then, he gently put his hand on Lu Chen's shoulder and walked out with his arm around him. At the same time, he said, why do you sound a little surprised about this? Chapter 618. You killed Elder Gui. Even though Lu Chen was usually calm and collected, he couldn't help but be shocked when he heard what perfected Lord Tianlan said. He turned to look at him in shock. Perfected Lord Tianlan's palm was still on Lu Chen's shoulder. He didn't turn his head and was still looking at the door that was getting brighter and brighter. His eyes narrowed slightly and his smile was warm but deep. He said with a smile, yes. After a pause, he said, why? You sound very surprised. Lu Chen felt a little unaccustomed to perfected Lord Tianlan putting his hand on his shoulder. In the past, even when he was still a child, perfected Lord Tianlan had never acted so intimately with him. However, he was not stupid enough to fling that hand away. Perhaps in his heart, he more or less felt a little bit of this person's love for him. However, that palm was warm, thick and wide. Although it wasn't a mountain, it gave people the illusion that a mountain was pressing down on them. It was as if they would be crushed to pieces in the next moment. Lu Chen thought that this was probably because when one's cultivation was too high and his strength was too strong, he would inadvertently give people a strong pressure. Or maybe it was because his habit of being a shadow was too strong. Anyone who got a little closer to him would make him feel threatened. Lu Chen shook his head slightly, shook off the boundless sense of danger in his mind, sighed and said, we've been chasing that guy for so many years, but we've never caught him. Even though we've basically defeated the remnants of the evil faction in the Immortal City a while ago, he still escaped and became a fish that slipped through the net. He turned to look at perfected Lord Tianlan and said, I didn't expect you to actually be able to find and kill him. This time, perfected Lord Tianlan turned his head and smiled at Lu Chen's expression. There was a glimmer in the depths of his eyes. Then, he nodded and smiled without saying a word. Lu Chen seemed to have thought of something. After pondering for a moment, he suddenly asked, but did you find him in the underground city? We've searched there many times in the past, but we've never found any trace of him. How did you find him this time? His expression suddenly changed slightly and he asked in a low voice, is it related to the matter with White Lotus? As they spoke, they had already walked to the entrance of Kunlun's main hall. The sunlight shone down and shone on perfected Lord Tianlan's face. The warmth seemed to be able to seep into the depths of one's heart. Even the coldest ice would warm up a little. Perfected Lord Tianlan's footsteps paused for a moment before he withdrew his hand from Lu Chen's shoulder. Yes. He responded to Lu Chen and then walked out. Atsu was lying on the ground in front of the door of the room that originally belonged to Su Qingjun and now inexplicably belonged to White Lotus. It was snoring loudly. The cold wind in the middle of the night seemed to be unable to blow through the layer of glossy fur on its body and did not affect its sweet dreams at all. Now that the sun had risen and the sunlight had brought warmth, this black dog slept even more soundly. Until one moment, in the room behind it, in the silence that had been maintained for a whole night, a slight sound was suddenly heard. In its sleep, Atsu did not move and did not even open its eyes. However, one of its ears suddenly stood up and trembled slightly. After a while, the sound of intermittent footsteps came from inside the house. However, the person inside the house seemed to be struggling, as if he had suffered a serious injury. Even walking had become difficult. However, from the sound of the footsteps, it seemed that the person in the room was moving slowly towards the door. Atsu's eyes snapped wide open. There was no tiredness and laziness in its eyes. Instead, there was a sharp and murderous look in its eyes. As if it felt something, this black dog slowly got up, turned around, and stared at the door as if it was facing a formidable enemy. But soon, Atsu suddenly sniffed again, as if its extremely sensitive sense of smell played a role at this moment, and it smelled something again. This smell was undoubtedly familiar to Atsu. It suddenly became puzzled, and the murderous look on its body faded a lot. There was a hint of doubt in its eyes. The footsteps in the room were still ringing. One step, one stop, one step, one stop, one step, one stop. It seemed to be walking with great difficulty. But even in this strange rhythm, it could still roughly feel that the person in the room seemed to be recovering from a serious illness and was slowly recovering. The pauses between the footsteps became shorter and shorter. Not long after, the person in the room walked behind the door. Now, there was only a thin door between Atsu and the person in the room. Atsu stared at the door. It did not roar, nor did it bark, nor did it have the intention to turn around and leave. For some reason, the situation looked a bit like a confrontation between Atsu and the unknown person. The room became quiet. Perhaps the person in the room felt something, but the door was still closed. The person in the room did not open the door, nor did he have the intention to come out. After a while, the footsteps sounded again, but it gradually left the door and slowly walked to the other side of the room. Then, it gradually faded until the sound completely disappeared, and everything became quiet again. Atsu looked at the door quietly, then looked up at the sky. It was unclear whether he was looking at the sky or the warm sun. Then, he lay down on the ground, like a loyal guard, fulfilling his promise from beginning to end. Supreme Tianlan did not tell Lu Chen more about Elder Ghost, including the strange time and place, and the strange way. He did not even mention a word about Lu Chen sending him away. Of course, Lu Chen was not very satisfied with this, but the person standing in front of him was the most powerful person in the world, a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, so he could do and say whatever he wanted, and no one could force him to do so. Although Lu Chen was not convinced, he still accepted this result. Fortunately, his original intention of coming here this time was more or less answered by Supreme Tianlan, so he did not gain nothing. In addition, he seemed to vaguely feel that in this rare master-disciple relationship of theirs, their relationship had probably become a little better. Or in other words, perfected Lord Tianlan would more or less trust him. Lu Chen could not say whether he was happy or sad about this, but he could only accept it. But before leaving, he still found a chance to say to Supreme Tianlan, "By the way, there's something I've wanted to discuss with you for a long time. Let's talk about it by the way today." "Huh?" Supreme Tianlan said, "What is it?" "I'm going to find Supreme Tiehu and help someone pass a message to him." Lu Chen smiled bitterly and said, "I know your relationship is not very good, and the atmosphere in the Immortal Allies is a little subtle recently, so I haven't gone there. I want to see if I can delay it until a good time. But now I feel that it has been delayed for too long, so I want to inform you. Do you think it's convenient?" Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at him with a calm expression. "Who are you passing a message for?" "There are not many people in this world who are qualified to pass a message to a perfected cultivator of the deity realm." "Oh, actually, it's not a human, but a wolf," Lu Chen said honestly. Chapter 619. Yes, the heavenly wolf on the Great Snow Mountain was very likely to be the father of the stupid dog of Atsu. The ancient divine beast with a body as huge as a hill had once entrusted Lu Qin to pass a message to a guy named Tiehu after he returned to the central region. Of course, there were not many people named Tiehu in the world. As long as one was not a fool or a moron, he or she would probably know the word taboo. For example, after Baldi became famous all over the world, there would not be many children named Tianlan. On the contrary, if someone had the word Tianlan in their name, in order to avoid trouble, they would often change their name. It might not be a big deal to have the same name as a powerful and unattainable perfected deity of Huashan realm. Therefore, Lu Qin did not need to investigate too carefully to be sure that the person the heavenly wolf wanted to pass the message to must be immortal Tiehu, one of the 6 perfected deity of Zhengxianmeng. In addition to the above reasons, there was actually another very simple reason. That was, the heavenly wolf was a terrible ancient fierce beast, and the great snow mountain was a dangerous place. How could ordinary people get close to it? After thinking about it, the only possible candidate left was immortal Tiehu. It had been a long time since Lu Qin returned to the central region from the Great Snow Mountain, including the time when he arrived at the immortal city where the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng was located. During this period, he had seen immortal Tiehu several times, but almost all of them were in the presence of many outsiders, and most of the time, immortal Tianlan was also present. As the only successor of immortal Tianlan, Lu Qin was rapidly integrating into the system of Fuyunji and gradually becoming the kind of person who held power in Zhengxianmeng. At the same time, of course, he could feel the undercurrent surging between immortal Tianlan and immortal Tiehu, as well as between Fuyunji and Tianjutsu Hall. Under such circumstances, of course, Lu Qin didn't want to do anything that might be misunderstood by Lord Tianlan. For example, he inexplicably went to meet immortal Tiehu alone and said something that nobody knew. Perhaps Lord Tianlan wouldn't necessarily suspect him, but this was purely making trouble for himself. Therefore, Lu Qin originally wanted to suppress this matter for a period of time. When the battle between these two big shots calmed down a little, when everyone calmed down and the conflict was not so sensitive, he would find an opportunity to pass on a message. Anyway, Sirius was far away in the Great Snowy Mountain, and there was no time limit when they parted. It should be okay to drag it out for a while. Listening to Lu Chen's narration and explanation, true Lord Tianlan's expression gradually calmed down. He looked at Lu Chen thoughtfully. After a while, he did not see any anger or strange look on his face. Instead, he looked at Lu Chen with interest and said, "This matter is nothing. I approve. Go and talk to Tai Hu." But he shook his big head and asked curiously, "I'm a little curious. Your original idea is not wrong. It's okay to wait for a period of time to talk about it. Why did you suddenly change your mind now?" After a moment of silence, Lu Chen said, "I thought for a while just now, and I have a feeling that you probably won't have a good relationship anymore." He sighed and said, "I have officially promised Sirius about this matter. Although that guy is not a human, he is more terrible than a human. After thinking about it, I think it's better to end this matter as soon as possible so that I don't have to worry about it." True Lord Tianlan looked at him for a while and suddenly laughed. He nodded and said, "Good, end it as soon as possible. All right, you go and talk to him." Lu Chen said and nodded to true Lord Tianlan as a greeting. Then, he was about to leave. However, when he had only taken 2 or 3 steps, true Lord Tianlan's voice suddenly came from behind. "Oh yes, what message did Sirius ask you to pass to old man Tai Hu? Can you say it?" Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. At that moment, a thought flashed through his mind. Logically speaking, the content of a request for a message was naturally more confidential under normal circumstances. However, when Sirius told him about it that day, it didn't seem to specifically say that it was to be kept strictly confidential. Apart from that, the damn Baldi standing in front of him was obviously not an ordinary person. Therefore, Lu Chen quickly understood the situation. He nodded and said, "It's not a big deal. You can say it." He paused for a moment and said, "Sirius asked me to tell Tai Hu that it's time to return the leaf that I borrowed from him." True Lord Tianlan raised his eyebrows as if he was a little surprised, as if he did not understand what he said. He said with a hint of astonishment, "Leaf?" But after only a short moment, his face suddenly changed, yet his eyes shone brightly as he suddenly took a step forward and said in a deep voice, "You're saying that the devil cult's legendary one of the 4 divine weapons with 2 leaves and 1 seed is in this immortal city Sky Dragon Mountain, and is in the hands of that old man Tai Hu?" As he finished speaking, his expression became stern and solemn. It was as if this matter was unexpectedly important to him. Obviously, Lu Chen did not expect that True Lord Tianlan would have such a big reaction after hearing this. For a moment, he was a little stunned and stood rooted to the ground. However, although he looked a little stiff on the surface, in the blink of an eye, his mind was already spinning rapidly like a whirlwind. In an instant, he carefully thought through this matter from the beginning to the end. In fact, when he first heard what Sirius told him, Lu Chen had guessed in his heart that the leaf that Sirius mentioned was very likely to be one of the 4 pieces of the divine tree passed down by the devil sect. This was because both Sirius and Tai Hu's status were too high. Other than the legendary leaf of the divine tree, he could not think of any other leaf in this world that was worthy for them to specially discuss about debt collection. Of course, as for why the leaf of the devil's sect would be in the hands of Sirius, and why Tai Hu, who was the righteous path's Zhengxiameng and the archenemy of the devil's sect, would actually borrow this leaf, it was an extremely complicated and confusing matter. There might be a big secret in it. But now, to Lu Chen, all this was temporarily not important. What he had to face was True Lord Tianlan's questioning. Therefore, after a moment of hesitation, Lu Chen decided to tell the truth. He said, "To be honest, I don't know. When Sirius told me, he did not explicitly say that it was the leaf of the divine tree of the devil sect. But I guess it is very possible." He took a glance at perfected Lord Tianlan and his heart skipped a beat. Then, he added, "Actually, it's also because I have this suspicion. Therefore, before I went to look for perfected Lord Tiehu, I thought about it and decided to tell you first to see what you think." True Lord Tianlan stared at Lu Chen. After a while, he slowly nodded with a trace of gratification on his face. Then, he looked deeply into the distance. Lu Chen looked over and found that it was in the direction of the Heavenly Law Hall. After a while, he heard True Lord Tianlan said indifferently, "You'd better go over and say the same thing to the old man Tai Hu. Also, just say that this matter was kept a secret from Sirius and you did not tell me. Let's see how he reacts." After saying that, he slightly narrowed his eyes, but the corners of his mouth curled into a slightly cold smile. Chapter 620. Lu Chen left the main hall of Kunlun, but he didn't rush to the Heavenly Law Hall immediately. Instead, he went to the house where White Lotus was after thinking for a while. From afar, Lu Chen saw the black dog lying at the door. It seemed that it was still doing its duty after a night of waiting. Lu Chen smiled and walked over to pat its head. Of course, Atsu had already woken up. It stood up when it saw Lu Chen and wagged its tail at him. Although there was a huge difference in size between Atsu and Sirius, in Lu Chen's eyes, he could see that Atsu already had the temperament and outline of Sirius. When Lu Chen thought that Atsu, which had been by his side all these years, might become a terrifying beast that could summon wind and rain and look down on the world like Sirius, Lu Chen couldn't help but feel that it was unreal. If he thought about it this way, perhaps Atsu would not stay by his side for too long. There were always some spiritual beasts in this world that were born with pride. Perhaps they would linger because of their feelings, but they would never succumb and become slaves. Perhaps it would be time for Atsu to leave when it was strong enough. Lu Chen smiled. Although there was a little regret in his heart, he wasn't sad or disappointed. He stretched out his hand and patted Atsu's neck. He said with a smile, "You've worked hard." Atsu looked up at Lu Chen. It seemed to have sensed Lu Chen's feelings. Its eyes were very gentle, and it even took the initiative to rub its head against Lu Chen's arm. At that moment, their minds seemed to be faintly connected. After a while, Lu Chen patted Atsu's head and stood up straight. He turned his gaze to the door behind Atsu. Yesterday, when he left White Lotus here, he did not take good care of White Lotus's injuries. The condition of the girl's body was too strange. Since Supreme Tianlan was unwilling to help, Lu Qin did not have a good idea. He could only use the power of black fire to try to limit and soothe the violent spiritual power. Needless to say, this risky method actually worked in the end. White Lotus's condition was slightly stabilized, but it was still far from a full recovery. It was just that the inexplicable spiritual power in her body seemed to have weakened, and Lu Qin himself didn't know when White Lotus's condition would worsen again. At the very least, he knew in his heart that there was a huge problem with that girl. Perhaps, if this matter really went according to Supreme Tianlan's plan, it would be better for everyone to ignore it and let White Lotus die in silence. Lu Qin shook his head slightly, pushed the door open, and walked in. Behind him, Black Dog looked a little gloomy. It stared at the dark room that Lu Qin walked into. It had one foot in the doorstep, but for some reason, it did not move forward. Just like that, it stood at the door that was neither inside nor outside, as if it was watching or guarding against something. Lu Qin did not notice the strange behavior of Atsu. After he came in, he glanced around the room and soon saw White Lotus lying on the bed. She was covered with a quilt, and her back was facing the wall. It seemed that she had not moved since yesterday. Sure enough, her serious injuries have not recovered. Lu Qin sighed in his heart, and the way he looked at White Lotus was a little complicated. This girl was not close to him, but there were many entanglements between them. With his very tough character, he rarely softened his heart to others, but for some reason, he seemed to see White Lotus in a different light. This kind of feeling actually made Lu Qin feel a little strange. For a time, he even wondered if there was something wrong with his brain to like such a young girl. But later, he quickly realized that his feelings for White Lotus were not the kind of love between a man and a woman, but as for what it was, he did not know. Perhaps, he had always lacked too many emotions. He slowly walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. At the door, Atsu stood on the doorstep, staring at Lu Qin's figure and movements, and seemed to be a little nervous. Lu Qin still did not notice the strange behavior of Atsu. He softly called White Lotus's name, but White Lotus did not move and did not respond. He did not know whether she was asleep or still unconscious. Lu Qin was a little worried, so he reached out his hand to the front of White Lotus's body, and leaned on her white forehead, wanting to see her condition. But at this moment, Atsu suddenly looked up, as if it felt something, and its eyes shone brightly. At the same time, on the delicate and beautiful face of White Lotus, although her eyes were still closed, the corner of her mouth twitched slightly. Then, from the shadow under the quilt, a hand suddenly reached out and grabbed Lu Qin's palm. "Hold it tightly." The room instantly became quiet, and there was no sound. The master of Starry Hall, Lord Guyu, was a relatively low-key person in Zhengxianmeng most of the time. Of course, that was compared to the other 5 spirit-severing perfected lords. Correspondingly, in order to adapt to his temperament, Starry Hall was usually very peaceful and low-key. Not only did they rarely cause trouble, but when they encountered conflicts, especially with powerful halls, unless they were obviously in the right, Starry Hall would usually give in more times, even when the odds were 50-50. This situation, of course, would be noticed and taken advantage of. But no matter what, the strength of Lord Guyu and Starry Hall could not be ignored, so in most cases, everyone would leave some face. Except for Fuyunji. Fuyunji, this hall was arrogant and despotic, and actually had the same temperament as its founder and leader, Lord Tianlan. Especially in these years, Lord Tianlan's prestige was like the sun in the sky. After defeating the last remnants of the devil cult, it reached a state of insufferably arrogant. The entire hall of Fuyunji, in the immortal city, had reached a state where they could do whatever they wanted and despise all other halls. In the eyes of the people of Fuyunji, this great territory of Zhengxianmeng was mostly fought for by Lord Tianlan and Fuyunji. Whether it was the foundation or the prestige, of course, it all belonged to their side. As for the other parasites, they were nothing more than vampires trying to cling onto him. With such a mood, of course, Fuyunji's attitude towards the other halls would not be any better. Of course, no one knew if there was some connivance from the higher-ups of Fuyunji. Not to mention, a few days ago, both Starry Hall and Fuyunji guarded the entrance of the underground city and repaired the underground ruins. But after a small conflict between Lord Tianlan and Lord Guyu, Fuyunji actually chased those people from Starry Hall away. She chased him away without any hesitation. This scene made many people dumbfounded, made many people in Starry Hall angry, and also made many people in Fuyunji secretly feel that it was a little too much. So on this day, when Lord Guyu suddenly appeared at the entrance of the tunnel, the group of guards in Fuyunji all stared with their eyes wide open, at a loss of what to do, and their scalps tingling. This spirit-severing stage lord, could it be that she was here to cause trouble? Under the guesses and worried gazes of the crowd, Lord Guyu walked over expressionlessly, then pointed at the entrance of the tunnel and told the people beside her, "I want to go down and take a look." Chapter 621. The guards at the entrance of the underground city were still led by Lu Ting. Lu Ting himself was also standing in front of the crowd. Looking at the approaching Guyu Lord, his heart was in turmoil. He felt extremely depressed, and even a sense of grievance as though he had nothing left to live for. What kind of luck was this? What kind of world was this? Wasn't he just a guard here? There were countless people like him in the whole of Immortal City and Zhengxianmeng, but why did it seem like he was the unluckiest? The person walking over was not an ordinary person, but an unreachable demigod perfected lord. Even though this perfected lord and his starry hall were relatively low-key, he was still an existence that cultivators like Lu Ting could only look up to. To put it bluntly, if he angered this Guyu perfected lord, she could just find an excuse to kill him with one slap. It would be difficult for Fuyunji to avenge Lu Ting. What could they do to a demigod perfected lord? To deal with a demigod perfected lord, the whole of Fuyunji would have to go all out, or they could directly get rid of someone like perfected Lord Tianlan. Only then would they be able to seek justice for a small fry like Lu Ting. But was it worth it to do so? Even though everyone in the world said that all living things were equal, but in this Middle Earth, there were still differences in the lives of people. Of course, those who could reach the level of a soul formation perfected lord were all peerless talents. Not only did they have extremely high cultivation levels, but they also had their own poise when interacting with others. Normally, they wouldn't hold a grudge against insignificant figures. But what if? Lu Ting didn't want to become that, if at all. He hoped that there wouldn't be any accidents at all. He loved being alive, and there were still many things he wanted to enjoy. He just had a chance to get acquainted with young Master Lu Chen, who had a bright future ahead of him. He didn't want to die at all. Lu Ting sighed in his heart. If only I could just ignore everything and run away. Lu Ting sighed. But Fuyunji had always had strict rules. Since they were stationed here, they naturally had the responsibility of guarding. Lu Ting was the leader of the guards, so he was even more duty-bound. If he slipped away, the person who wanted to kill him would be Fuyunji. In comparison, Lu Ting didn't want to go against the Fuyunji that he was in at all. He wouldn't even dare to. Thus, he braced himself and tried to put on a warm and respectful smile. He bowed to the Guyu perfected lord and said, "Greetings, milord. I am Lu Ting, a guard from Fuyunji." True monarch Guyu stopped and looked at Lu Ting who was blocking her way. Lu Ting immediately felt a chill run down his spine. In that instant, he even had the illusion that the wind had suddenly become shrill, as if a huge palm was about to slap him into meat paste in the next moment. Fortunately, after calming himself down, the surroundings seemed to be as calm as before. Lu Ting sneaked a glance at his surroundings and discovered that Guyu Supreme's expression was calm and composed, without any signs of anger. However, the floating clouds division guards behind him had all silently retreated a few steps back, causing Lu Ting to stand out in front of Guyu Supreme all of a sudden, making him stand out in front of Guyu Supreme. These bastards! Lu Ting was furious. He secretly swore that if he could survive today, he would go back and teach these unreliable subordinates a lesson. He would torture them until they were half dead to vent his anger. But now was not the time to vent his anger. There was still a terrifying demigod perfected lord standing in front of him. Lu Ting revealed a smile that was uglier than crying. He laughed dryly and said, "Milord, this place is guarded by Fuyunji. Our sect's hall leader Shui personally told us that unless it is true monarch Tianlan or herself, no one is allowed to enter the underground cave." True monarch Guyu frowned and looked at Lu Ting. As if a bucket of cold water had been poured over his head, Lu Ting felt as if his body had fallen into an ice cellar. Even his voice was slightly trembling. At this time, Lu Ting did not know if it was the strict rules of Fuyunji that were suppressing him or if he was too afraid and forgot to escape. Could it be that he was really so unlucky that he would die here today? Just as Lu Ting was letting his imagination run wild, he suddenly heard Guyu perfected monarch say with an indifferent expression, "I've gone down several times with your perfected monarch Tianlan, including a while ago when our two halls were stationed here together. Why, now you won't even let me go?" Lu Ting was first shocked, then happy. He was shocked that this true monarch seemed to be determined to go down to the underground cave. Then he was overjoyed that true monarch Guyu seemed to be in a good mood and was actually willing to be reasonable. It was good that she was willing to be reasonable. Lu Ting's spirit was lifted and his expression became even more respectful. He bowed towards true monarch Guyu and tried his best to show his obedience and respect. Then he said softly, "Reporting to my lord, this is indeed not because I have the guts to make things difficult for you, but because it is the rules set by the higher-ups. You see, with your status, it shouldn't be difficult for you to know the rules of our Fuyunji. Although I absolutely do not dare to stop you, but if you just walk in like this, then I will probably be thrown into Fuyunji's prison and have my tendons pulled out and my skin skinned." True monarch Guyu frowned and did not speak, but was obviously hesitant. It seemed that this true monarch was indeed a kind person. Even though their statuses were like heaven and earth, he was still unwilling to make things difficult for a small fry. Lu Ting was extremely grateful for this and had a very good impression of true monarch Guyu. He almost knelt down and kowtowed. After a while, true monarch Guyu nodded and said, "I understand your concerns and the fact that you have no choice but to do this, but I do have an important matter to attend to. How about this, send someone to the Kunlun temple to pass a message and tell Tianlan that I am here. As for whether to let me in or not, just ask him to give me a clear answer. But don't blame me for not reminding you, I won't wait forever. I will give you at most an hour." After saying that, he walked to the side and stood with his hands behind his back, as if he really was waiting. Seeing this scene, Lu Ting was so touched that tears almost flowed down his cheeks. He hurriedly thanked him, then turned around and rushed back to the crowd. He did not even have the time to get angry at his subordinates who did not have the spirit of loyalty. First, he snatched the best chair and carefully placed it beside true monarch Guyu. Then, he came back to inform the crowd, turned around and ran towards the Kunlun temple on Mount Tianlong. True monarch Tianlan only found out about what happened at the foot of the mountain after a little longer than the time it took to drink a cup of tea. His face was very calm, but his eyes flickered a few times, as if he was thinking about something. This was the first time Lu Ting, who was kneeling in the middle of the hall, stepped into this place that was the highest place for people in the Fuyunji system. He did not dare to look around. After a while, he suddenly heard an angry rebuke from above, "How dare you, Guyu? Are you trying to provoke me?" A gust of wind blew and the tall and burly figure had already reached the entrance of the hall. Lu Ting stood up in shock and heard true monarch Tianlan's cold voice, "Follow me to meet this arrogant old man." Chapter 622. The hand that grabbed Lu Chen was slender and white. Perhaps because it was too pale, there was no color of blood. One could even vaguely see the blue blood vessels inside. This palm looked very perfect. If one didn't care about the cold aura, it could be considered very beautiful. But it was very cold. That hand was very, very cold. It seemed to be a bit colder than ice. A chill passed through his skin. Lu Chen frowned. Behind him, Atsu at the door of this room growled in a low voice. It was a bit vigilant and angry. In contrast, Lu Chen didn't seem to be angry. He seemed to be more surprised. He stared at the hand that grabbed him for a moment, then lowered his head, looked at White Lotus, and said, "You're awake?" White Lotus's body was on her side. It seemed that she had been lying down for a long time. A strand of beautiful hair slipped from her temple to her cheek. It was black, shiny, smooth, and had a trace of silent laziness. If it was a sunny day on an embroidered bed in a young girl's boudoir on a sunny afternoon, this might be a beautiful picture with a poetic feeling. But at this moment, in the cold surroundings, she seemed a bit haggard and lonely. White Lotus slowly opened her eyes. Her face was still a bit pale. The injuries caused by her injuries had not yet healed. The long sleep seemed to have made her a little confused. She felt unfamiliar with her surroundings. She slowly looked around and then sat up. Her eyes swept around and then fell on Lu Chen, who was sitting beside her. She lowered her head and saw that her hand was still holding Lu Chen's hand. She held it very tightly. Her nails could even be faintly seen slightly sinking into the flesh of Lu Chen's palm. Atsu slowly took 2 steps forward. Its pair of eyes stared at White Lotus. It no longer made a sound, but a pair of fangs was revealed. Even some of the hair on its neck was faintly standing up. It looked like it was going to pounce on White Lotus in the next moment. But at this moment, Lu Chen's other hand on his side gently waved at Atsu. Atsu saw this movement and then stopped. Lu Chen looked at White Lotus. His face was calm, but his eyes were not all gentle and peaceful. He seemed to be a bit complicated. He asked White Lotus, "What's wrong?" White Lotus was startled. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she waved her arm, seemingly wanting to take her hand back. But at this moment, Lu Chen suddenly turned his hand over and instantly grabbed White Lotus's hand. He then continued to ask, "Do you feel uncomfortable?" Her hand was very cold, but his rough hand was very warm. White Lotus's arm paused for a moment as if she was thinking for a moment. Then she said in a low voice, "I'm fine." Of course, White Lotus couldn't really be fine. She was just being polite. As long as Perfected Lord Tianlong didn't take action, Lu Chen basically couldn't think of anyone on Tianlong Mountain who could cure her strange injury. Of course, it might be possible for the other 5 Perfected Lords of the Divine Transformation Realm, but the difficulty of making them take action would not be lower than that of Perfected Lord Tianlong. Even though Lu Chen took the risk to use the power of black fire to restrain the violent spiritual power in White Lotus's body, the effect was far beyond his expectations. Perhaps this was also the power of black fire. But since White Lotus was awake, he had something to ask her. "How did you get the injury on your body?" He looked at White Lotus and did not beat around the bush. Instead, he went straight to the point. In particular, there's an incomparably violent and powerful spiritual energy in your body. I've never seen it before. Where did it come from? White Lotus's body trembled, and her face became paler. She moved her arm hard again, as if she wanted to pull her hand back like a child to protect herself. But Lu Chen's palm didn't move at all, and he still held her firmly. "I've asked Tianlong to see your injury. There's no need for you to pretend." He looked at White Lotus, whose face changed dramatically in an instant, with a hint of sarcasm on his face. He said, "Why, did you think you could hide it from him?" White Lotus wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Finally, she let out a long sigh. Lu Chen frowned. In terms of age, White Lotus was only a young girl. Her sigh sounded as if she had already experienced the vicissitudes of life. She sounded like an old woman without any vitality to speak of. "What happened to your injury?" he asked again. White Lotus looked at Lu Chen's serious face, hesitated for a moment, and said, "I wanted to follow you and Oxen that day, so I followed you into the underground cave." Lu Chen nodded and thought it was true. Then, he heard White Lotus said, "Later, in the underground, you and Oxen suddenly retreated for no reason. I didn't leave immediately, but walked around the underground and looked around. As a result, I was suddenly controlled by a weirdo." Lu Chen raised his eyebrows and said, "A weirdo?" White Lotus nodded and said after thinking for a moment, it was a man wearing a mask. If I'm not wrong, he seemed to be very similar to the legendary ghost elder of the devil cult. Lu Chen fell silent and didn't know what to say for a moment. After a while, he gently let go of White Lotus's hand and asked, "What happened later?" White Lotus withdrew her palm and gently rubbed it with her hand. She said, "After he controlled me, he put a restriction on me. Then I fainted and didn't know anything. When I woke up, I was here." Lu Chen frowned slightly and looked at White Lotus's eyes. He frowned and said, "You don't remember what happened later?" "I don't remember." White Lotus answered straightforwardly and firmly. "What happened later? Did you bring me back?" Lu Chen sighed and said with a wry smile, "More or less. Later, Tianlan and I went underground together, and then we found something wrong with a house in the underground city. When we went over to have a look, we found you." White Lotus wanted to ask a few more questions, but at this moment, a voice suddenly came from outside the house. It was a voice both of them were familiar with. Old Ma arrived and said loudly, "Lu Chen, come quickly. Immortal Milord asked you to go to the entrance of the underground cave at the foot of the mountain immediately. He said that Immortal Guyu has gone there and there seems to be some trouble." "Immortal Guyu of Star Hall?" Lu Chen immediately stood up. Although that immortal usually kept a low profile, as long as it involved a perfected master of Huashan realm, it would not be a small matter. Moreover, they were in the underground cave where there were endless troubles. "You take a rest first. Don't wander around and wait for me to come back." Lu Chen turned around and said to White Lotus, then strode out. Atsu stared at White Lotus and followed him out of the door. As expected, he saw Old Ma waiting outside the door. Lu Chen greeted him and walked down the mountain quickly. At the same time, he asked casually, "Why don't you go in and talk?" Old Ma shrugged and shook his body, which seemed to have gained weight recently. He said, "I don't like the atmosphere in the room. It's a little cold." Lu Chen's footsteps paused slightly, but the expression on his face didn't change much. He still walked quickly. Chapter 623. Zhengxianmeng was a huge organization that commanded the world. Its prestige was so high that there was not even a second famous sect that could be compared to it. They looked down on the world and were invincible. At the same time, they announced to most of the cultivators and mortals that Zhengxianmeng was a united alliance, a victorious alliance, and an alliance that upheld justice. Anyone who dared to go against Zhengxianmeng had only one ending, death. The devil cult was the best example. So what if they had a long history? So what if they were powerful? So what if they were vicious and vicious? In the end, they were all defeated by the efforts of Zhengxianmeng and the world's righteous, and they were about to become yesterday's flower. At least in today's world, as long as Zhengxianmeng did not have any problems, this organization would be invincible in the world. Most people in the world understood this. Of course, the people in Zhengxianmeng also understood this. Therefore, most of the time, everyone maintained a harmonious, gentle, and united appearance. As for the disputes, quarrels, and struggles for power and profit, of course, they were all false rumors, malicious rumors created by demons and clowns like the devil cult. As the top figures in Zhengxianmeng, the few divine transformation stage perfected cultivators certainly had a deep friendship with each other. They got along well with each other, and there was no estrangement at all. For example, on this day, on the long street in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City, perfected cultivator Tianlan and perfected cultivator Guyu were standing outside the entrance of the tunnel, full of smiles, talking cheerfully and wittily, talking about everything in the world. They were outstanding and extraordinary, like immortals, showing the bearing of two divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, and the indestructible strength of Zhengxianmeng's unity. Well, except that their voices were a little louder when they were talking. When Lu Chen arrived at the street with Atsu and Old Ma, he found that both sides of the street had been surrounded by Fuyunji's people. All outsiders were blocked. Except for Zhengxianmeng, or to be exact, Fuyunji's people, no one was allowed to pass. Needless to say, the purpose of this method was to cover up and keep the secret. However, Lu Chen did not have the slightest confidence in the effect of this method. At least in Zhengxianmeng, the other major forces would definitely know what was happening here. Everyone was a sieve, and they all knew what they were doing. With Lu Chen's identity, the Fuyunji guards certainly wouldn't stop him, so the two of them smoothly entered the long street. After walking on the streets that were quieter than usual for a while, Lu Chen heard a familiar deep voice that was like rolling thunder, extremely imposing and dignified. Except for Supreme Tianlan, there was no one else. The voice rumbled in front of them like thunder, **T. The bald Supreme Tianlan was very annoyed and cursed. Lu Chen and Old Ma's footsteps paused subconsciously, and then they looked at each other. Old Ma looked a little embarrassed. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought, and his expression was a little funny. However, Lu Chen was much more natural in front of him. He said calmly, "That's how boorish people are." Old Ma's face turned pale, and then he looked at Lu Chen bitterly and complained, "I know you're bold and dare to say anything, but can you not say it to me?" Lu Chen waved his hand carelessly and said, "It's okay, I believe you, and I'm not afraid of that damn Baldy. But I am afraid, brother." Old Ma's fat face fell, and he didn't know whether to laugh or cry. He said, "I'm afraid that if those words reach the ears of that lord, you'll be fine, but I'll be punished as a punching bag." "What should I do then?" Lu Chen was stunned and said, "Is that possible?" Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, "What do you think?" Lu Chen thought for a while and then nodded, "You don't say." "I've thought about it carefully. That damn Baldy might really do such a thing. It's a tactic that he often uses to beat the mountain to scare the tiger." Old Ma glared at him, and it seemed that he had nothing to say to this person. Lu Chen laughed heartily and patted Old Ma's shoulder. For some reason, after chatting and laughing with his old friend for a while, his tense and gloomy mood had lightened up a lot. Even the street in front of him seemed a little more spacious. Lu Chen laughed and patted Old Ma's shoulder. "Old Ma," Lu Chen walked forward with him with some emotion, and at the same time said, "To be honest, it's all thanks to you accompanying me for so many years. You're almost the only old friend I have. It's really good to have someone to talk to." Old Ma snorted, raised his head a little, and then said in a low voice, "That's good. Please tell me in advance if there's a chance to save my life, so that I can run away early." Lu Chen laughed heartily before sending a kick over. Perfected Lord Tianlan and Perfected Lord Guyu, the two giants who stood at the peak of Zhengxianmeng, were currently having a verbal exchange at the entrance of the tunnel. Both sides were friendly and sincere, and their words were cautious and accurate. Even when they occasionally asked about each other's personal safety, they were very polite. Moreover, both of them were very restrained, adhering to the principle of a gentleman using his mouth and not his fists. Although there was an earth-shattering sound, the scene didn't collapse. At most, the ground couldn't withstand the heavy pressure and cracked, and some stones were shattered as a demonstration. When Lu Chen walked over, he found that Lu Ting and the other guards were standing far away, looking as if they wished they could turn into stone people and not see or hear anything. Even when they saw Lu Chen and the others coming, they didn't say anything. At the entrance of the tunnel, the two perfected lords were still standing there, looking at them with their eyes wide open. It seemed that they had a big fight. Lu Chen looked at them and sighed in his heart. If it was possible, he really didn't want to walk next to these two obviously angry perfected lords, but the situation didn't let him go, so he had to walk forward. However, after walking for a short distance, Lu Chen suddenly felt that something was wrong. He looked back and found that Old Ma didn't follow him. Not only that, this guy even took a few steps back. Lu Chen scolded in a low voice, "You bastard, where's the spirit of brotherhood that you talked about as an old friend?" Old Ma said seriously, "Go by yourself, I'll help you collect your corpse." As he said that, he waved his hand, looking as if he wanted Lu Chen to go and not be a burden to him. Lu Chen rolled his eyes. He couldn't do anything to this cunning old friend of his. However, when he looked back, he found that the black dog had been following him all along and had no intention of backing down. This time, Lu Chen was very relieved. He sighed and said, "Humans are worse than dogs, Atsu is still more reliable." Woof! Atsu barked. Lu Chen smiled, but then he patted Atsu's head and pressed it to the ground. He said in a low voice, "Stay here." Atsu was silent and then lay down. Lu Chen walked over and came to perfected Lord Tianlan's side. The two big bosses' gazes fell on him, like two mountains pressing down on him. Facing two angry perfected lords of the divine transformation realm, the pressure was really not ordinary. Lu Chen took a deep breath, then with a respectful expression, he greeted the two of them. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked a little angry. He sneered and said, "You came at the right time. Our master of Starry Hall has a lot of opinions about Fuyunji. He even said that there's something wrong in the catacombs below and insisted on going down to take a look." "Forget it, I can't be bothered to go alone with you. Lu Chen, accompany perfected Lord Guyu down for a walk. If there's anything strange, don't hide it from us and tell us when you come back." Lu Chen raised his brows and glanced at perfected Lord Tianlan. Seeing that the latter's expression was the same as usual, Lu Chen nodded after a moment of silence. "Yes, sir." After that, he made an inviting gesture to perfected Lord Guyu and said, "This way please." Chapter 624. True Lord Guyu saw Lu Chen's actions and heard his calm and polite invitation, but he didn't move immediately. After sizing up Lu Chen, he didn't even respond to Lu Chen. Instead, he frowned slightly and raised his head to look at True Lord Tianlan. It was as if he didn't see Lu Chen as a person, or perhaps he felt that Lu Chen wasn't qualified to speak to him. Lu Chen stood there silently. His expression didn't change, and he wasn't angry at True Lord Guyu's disrespect. True Lord Guyu looked at True Lord Tianlan. Although he didn't say anything, his expression was very angry. He probably felt that they were both soul formation true lords, so he couldn't dismiss him so easily. However, behind that angry expression, a trace of surprise and doubt flashed across the depths of his eyes. At this distance, only True Lord Tianlan could see the extremely secretive hint of inquiry in his eyes. True Lord Tianlan ignored it and waved his hand impatiently. "Old geezers are always meddlesome. I don't have the patience to accompany you down. There are many things on this mountain. Lu Chen is my disciple. Letting him take you down is already giving you a lot of face." With that, he waved his sleeve and snorted coldly, looking very disdainful of True Lord Guyu. The atmosphere between the two of them immediately became tense, causing the surrounding guards to turn pale with fright. True Lord Guyu kept staring at True Lord Tianlan's eyes, as if he could see something from this damned Baldy's eyes. After a while, he nodded as if he knew the answer he wanted. He sneered and said to Lu Chen indifferently, "Lead the way." Lu Chen was the first to jump into the tunnel. He was no stranger to this place as he had come here many times. Just as he was about to turn around and wait for Guyu True Monarch, he felt a blur in front of him and the True Monarch's figure had already appeared behind him. Even with Lu Chen's current cultivation, he couldn't see True Lord Guyu's movements clearly. Lu Chen's heart trembled slightly, but his expression didn't change. He nodded to True Lord Guyu and was about to ask him to come with him. However, True Lord Guyu had already strode forward and said, "Let's go. I've been here many times and know what I'm doing." Lu Chen knew that he was speaking the truth. Back then, True Lord Tianlan True Lord Guyu had invited people from Star Hall to work in this underground cave. He had seen True Lord Guyu many times in this underground city. But now, if he didn't guess wrongly, this place should have been marked as a forbidden zone. Even the people from Fuyunji couldn't enter easily. In other words, in the houses near the strange statue, the bloody scene could still be there. True Lord Guyu came down to find trouble. Lu Chen probably knew a little about it. Of course, he didn't dare to let True Lord Guyu casually discover the crime scene. However, True Lord Guyu didn't seem to give Lu Chen any room to dissuade him. After saying that, he continued walking without any hesitation. Lu Chen was a little anxious. He secretly scolded Baldy a few more times. Just now, he couldn't communicate with Baldy in a hurry. Suddenly, he ordered him to come down. Lu Chen had no idea what he wanted to do. As they walked, the strange blood moon's light shone down and shone on the two of them. Lu Chen looked up and felt that his body was a little heavy. It seemed that the blood moon seemed to have changed. It seemed to have expanded a lot, and the light was also much stronger. But he didn't know if it was directly related to the blood sea in the sky outside. True Lord Guyu also looked up at the blood moon in the sky. His face didn't change, but a trace of worry flashed in the depths of his eyes. Then, he walked towards the center of the underground city. Lu Chen followed behind him and was secretly anxious. The house where the accident happened was near the statue. If they walked over like this, with true Lord Guyu's skills, he would almost definitely find out that something was wrong. Just as he was racking his brains to think of a way to solve this problem and lead Guyu Perfected Monarch astray, he suddenly heard Guyu Perfected Monarch, who was walking in front of him, say, "Your master trusts you very much." N. When Lu Chen heard this, he was stunned for a moment. He didn't really understand what this true lord meant. But then he still nodded and said, "Thank you Master Guyu for your praise. My master's kindness to me is as heavy as a mountain. I have always, he has never trusted a young person like this." True Lord Guyu interrupted Lu Chen's words. He stopped and turned to look at Lu Chen. This is a rare fate. It is also a great opportunity. You must cherish it. Lu Chen was stunned again. At this moment, he could obviously feel that there seemed to be some unfinished meaning in this true lord's words. He pondered for a moment and asked tentatively, "Master Guyu is right. I will remember it. But, why did you suddenly mention this?" True Lord Guyu smiled and didn't explain further. He turned and continued to walk forward, with the demeanor of a mysterious expert. Lu Chen felt a little helpless about this. The doubts in his heart grew heavier. In the end, he could only follow. In this huge underground city, it was quiet and empty. Only the two of them were walking here, and even the sound of their footsteps was especially clear. Seeing that the strange statue in the center was getting closer and closer to the murder case house, Lu Chen became a little anxious. At this moment, he suddenly heard True Lord Guyu say, "Do you know why Tian Lan refused to come down himself and wanted you to accompany me down here?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, "Probably because he doesn't like you." True Lord Guyu looked at him and suddenly laughed out loud. She nodded and said, "You are a little interesting." Amidst the laughter, they just happened to walk past the house. It seemed like Guyu True Monarch's attention was diverted by Lu Chen's sudden words. Who knew that when he reached the door, he turned around and without any hesitation, walked into the house naturally and straightforwardly. Lu Chen's face changed and his heart sank. True Lord Guyu stood at the door and even turned back to wave at him. She said calmly, "Come, let's go in and take a look." Lu Chen took a deep breath and tried hard to calm his racing heart. He then walked over. Real Lord Guyu walked in front with his hands behind his back, his eyes gazing at the unknown ahead. Walking leisurely, he said, "Many years ago, Tian Lan once told me that he was prepared to spend the rest of his life alone, with no children, no disciples, no worries. I think this is the reason why he is unruly and does things according to his heart. Perhaps it is because of this that he was able to build such a grand foundation, doing what we old men could not do in our lifetime." Lu Chen listened quietly. At the same time, he smelled a bloody smell. It seemed that in a short period of time, the traces would not completely disappear. But now he actually accepted you as a disciple and values you so much. Maybe he wanted you to accompany me to let me understand this. True Monarch Guyu walked in front of him and stopped when he was about to enter the backyard. From his voice, it could be heard that there was a hint of sorrow. "But I am a little worried. If he has worries, will it affect the big things he wants to do? You have to know that all the things he succeeded in the past were done without burdens." True Lord Guyu slowly turned around and looked at Lu Chen, staring at him. Lu Chen's heart suddenly jumped. He forced a smile and said, "What do you mean by this?" True Lord Guyu was silent for a moment and then said calmly, "I am thinking that this matter is very important. Should I go and help this old friend?" Chapter 625. Old friend? Help him. Lu Chen almost instantly grasped the few key and subtle words in Gu Yu's words. It was as if a huge wave had been set off in his heart, but it was soon followed by a sudden sense of danger. Putting aside whether perfected monarch Gu Yu's words about being perfected monarch Tian Lan's old friend or not, the last sentence about helping perfected monarch Tian Lan was rather cold. It was as if she wanted perfected monarch Tian Lan to return to his usual decisive and domineering self, and wanted to help him sever his ties. Lu Chen secretly swept the surroundings with the corner of his eye. Without any surprise, this place was quiet and desolate. Apart from the two of them, there was probably only the faint smell of blood in the courtyard. In such a huge underground cavern, was it a place where no one could call for help? At this moment, Lu Chen even subconsciously thought of an even more malicious thought. Was there some unspeakable deeper meaning behind perfected Lord Tianlan's insistence that he accompany perfected Lord Guyu down on his behalf? At this time, Guyu had already turned around and faced Lu Chen. Her expression was very calm, and her tone did not change. She said to Lu Chen, "What do you think of what I said just now?" Lu Chen slightly closed his eyes and suppressed the trace of irritation in his heart. He calmed his heart and smiled at Gu Yu, saying, "Master Gu Yu, you flatter me. Master's kindness towards me is as heavy as a mountain. Everything that I have today is given to me by my benefactor. My love and respect for him are even more so. However, although Master does care for me, I don't think it's to the extent that you're saying." He smiled and said, "My master is a man of great talent and strategy. He has single-handedly built up such a huge foundation. If you say that he will become weak and muddle-headed because of someone, please forgive me. I really do not dare to agree with you." Gu Yu Trulord made a sound of acknowledgement. She didn't seem to be angered by Lu Chen's sarcastic rebuttal. Instead, she nodded and said, "What you said makes some sense." Lu Chen felt slightly relieved in his heart, and then he said, "Besides that, forgive me for speaking bluntly. With the current status and prestige of my master and you, even if there are some hidden worries and mistakes, it might be possible for others to tactfully persuade you. But if someone were to overstep their authority and act arbitrarily without informing you, then I'm afraid it would instead truly infuriate you." Gu Yu pondered for a moment and actually nodded, saying, "That is indeed the case. If I were to put myself in someone else's shoes, I'd be displeased as well if someone treated me like this." He smiled at Lu Chen and said, "I didn't expect you to be so meticulous at such a young age." Lu Chen took a step back and said with a respectful expression, "I don't dare." Disciple spoke nonsense and was disrespectful. "Please forgive me, Master Gu Yu." Gu Yu looked at him quietly. After a while, he turned around and walked towards the backyard. At the same time, he said, "Let's go in and take a look." Seeing that he was no longer bothering his old friend and meddling in other people's business, Lu Chen could not help but heave a sigh of relief. However, before he could completely relax, he saw Gu Yu walk into the yard. His heart instantly jumped again. These days were really not for a person to live. Frightening, difficult, wave after wave. Even someone with a strong heart like Lu Chen felt a little overwhelmed at this time. However, he still had to face it. Lu Chen gritted his teeth and followed with large strides. At the same time, he secretly thought of a countermeasure. He was prepared to first say that he did not know anything, and when there was no other way, he would push all the blame onto that damn Baldy. In any case, that guy was the main culprit of everything. Saying anything about him was probably not wrong. Outside the tunnel entrance, True Lord Tian Lan, who was looking at the sky with his hands behind his back, suddenly trembled slightly. He felt that something was wrong. Once he walked into the yard, the smell of blood in the air became much thicker. What entered his eyes, Lu Chen saw that the ground, walls, and many corners were stained with blood. Even now, there were still a lot of blood stains left, very clearly left there. Even on the ground that had already dried up, there were many black lumps that looked disgusting and terrifying. Looking around, without much guessing, one could imagine that a lot of blood had flowed here, staining the ground and the surrounding corners red. Then, how many people had died here? Or perhaps there had been some kind of tragic and abnormal massacre here. Lu Chen asked himself. He realized that if he had not personally experienced the strange scene of White Lotus and that bloody man, he would probably have involuntarily imagined a bloody and tragic massacre. After all, there was too much blood here. But true Lord Guyu did not have such an experience. He came here and saw such a tragic scene. Then, what would he be thinking in his heart? If he wanted to get to the bottom of this, things would be troublesome. For a moment, Lu Chen did not know what to do. At the same time, there were some doubts in his heart. Logically speaking, with that damn Baldy's intelligence, it was impossible for him to not think of this danger. But why did he let true Lord Guyu come down? Of course, true Lord Guyu was also a demigod true lord. If he really had doubts about this underground cave and wanted to come down no matter what, there was indeed no one who could really stop him. But now, what exactly would happen? Lu Chen sneaked a glance at true Lord Guyu. He realized that ever since he walked into this bloody courtyard, true Lord Guyu had been silent. His gaze slowly swept across everything here. He looked at the ground, the walls, the corners, including the dry well in the courtyard, but he did not say a word. He just stood there quietly. After a while, he turned and said to Lu Chen, "Let's go." Left? Just like that. After true Lord Guyu said that, he walked straight out of the courtyard. Lu Chen looked at his back dumbfounded. But he quickly reacted and hurriedly followed. At the same time, his heart once again stirred up waves. He thought of what this true lord had said about old friends before. Recently, the entire Sky Dragon Mountain was filled with rumors that Guyu and Tianlan, these two big shots, had a very unpleasant quarrel. But now, it seemed that they really were so-called old friends. If these two deity transformation stage perfected lords were secretly colluding with one another, then just how big of a deal were they plotting? Lu Chen felt a chill in his heart as he followed the Guyu true lord out of the house, and then saw him walking the long way back. Lu Chen's heart was filled with many questions. But at this moment, he did not dare to ask. Just like that, he followed true Lord Guyu out of the cave and returned to the surface from the entrance of the tunnel. When they came out, countless gazes landed on Guyu perfected monarch, both in the open and in the dark. True Lord Guyu's expression was indifferent. He looked somewhat disdainful and cold. After a cold snort, he indifferently said, "If there's nothing else, I'm leaving." With that, he waved his sleeve and his entire body rose into the air. He actually flew directly into the air and then turned into a white rainbow, flying towards the direction of Sky Dragon Mountain at lightning speed. The surroundings were silent. After a while, a hearty laughter rang out. It was true Lord Tianlan. He chuckled and said, "Lu Chen, what did I say? There's nothing in the world that can't be said to others. It's just that some people think too much and come to find trouble. Now it's ugly, isn't it?" With that, he laughed loudly. The surrounding people also laughed along with him. Only Lu Chen lowered his head. There wasn't much of a smile on his face, but a trace of palpitation flashed across his eyes. Chapter 626. The news that Supreme Guyu had aggressively gone to Fuyunji's territory to find fault with them, but returned without any results quickly spread throughout Zhengxianmeng. Everyone was very curious about the actual situation at the time, and the description of the scene quickly spread, even though the people on that long street were almost all Fuyunji's men. This set off the old saying, "There is no such thing as an impenetrable wall," and once again proved the complicated power situation in Zhengxianmeng. Describing it as intertwined might not be entirely accurate, but it was still somewhat vivid. Interestingly, in this matter, most people didn't think that Supreme Guyu's information was fake, and thought that it was definitely the right thing to do. However, the reason why he returned without any results was because Fuyunji and Supreme Tianlan were so cunning that even a divine transformation true monarch couldn't do anything to them. Of course, there was also a small group of people who noticed that Supreme Guyu didn't enter the catacombs himself, but sent his disciple Lu Chen to follow Supreme Guyu down. Although this didn't seem to be too abrupt on the surface, as deity transformation stage perfected lords whose every move attracted the attention of tens of thousands of people, as well as the leaders of enormous forces, even the slightest of actions would be magnified by others. It was just that everyone's conclusions were sometimes different. Some people thought that Supreme Guyu was arrogant and sent his disciple to show his contempt for Supreme Guyu. Some thought that Supreme Guyu valued and trusted his disciple Lu Qin very much, and began to nurture this disciple so that he could build a relationship with other divine transformation true monarchs. However, there were also people who thought that Supreme Guyu was already dissatisfied with this disciple named Lu Qin, and began to vaguely express this to his subordinates in Fuyunji. It was even more likely that Supreme Guyu was using this method to hint to Xueying and other trusted subordinates of many years that they might receive news of Lu Chen's violent death in a few days. The same action could be interpreted in many different ways. This was probably because people were too smart in today's world. However, there were also people who were not affected by the waves of rumors, such as Lu Chen himself, because he felt that he was standing in the center of the storm. He saw and heard news that was far more real than outsiders. He understood the undercurrents and even the ups and downs of the waves under the calm sea, and in the near future, it would become a monstrous wave that would reach the heavens. If perfected Guyu's words in the underground city were not enough to convince him, then after they returned to the surface, perfected Guyu and perfected Tian Lan's short conversation, perfected Guyu's angry departure, and especially the fact that he and Tian Lan were incompatible like fire and water, yet he did not mention a word about what happened underground. All of this finally made Lu Qin completely certain that these two divine transformation stage perfected cultivators, who were enemies in everyone's eyes, had reached a tacit understanding and secretly colluded with each other. What were they going to do? What exactly was it that required people of their status and strength to secretly plot against it? The answer was almost obvious. Only other deity transformation perfected sovereigns of the same level could make a deity transformation perfected sovereign seriously plot against them. Then, to be able to make a powerful and unusually arrogant person like Tian Lan willing to lower his head and secretly plot an alliance, there must be more than one deity transformation perfected sovereign he had to deal with. At the very least, it was very likely that their strength was not below his and Guyu perfected sovereigns. Then there must be two deity transformation perfected sovereigns, or, even more. When Lu Chen thought of this, he felt a little suffocated, but very quickly, he felt a rare sense of excitement. This was a rare, or even unprecedented, legendary battle in the world. Even the bloody battle between Fuyunji and the devil cult over the years paled in comparison to this possibility. One must know that this was perhaps the pinnacle of the human cultivation world, and could easily determine the future of the human race and the direction of development. That damn Baldy was indeed an amazing person. Once he made his move, he was going to do something big. Do you think he believes me? On the way back, Lu Chen asked Old Ma, but before Old Ma could answer, he muttered to himself, "Now it seems that he probably believes me." Old Ma was a little puzzled by his muttering to himself, and asked, "What do you mean?" Lu Chen smiled, but changed the topic and said, "Well, it seems that all kinds of things have to be sped up. We can't dawdle anymore, time waits for no man." Old Ma's expression changed slightly, and he glanced at Lu Chen, subconsciously lowered his voice, and approached him, saying in a low voice, What's the situation here?" Lu Chen patted him on the shoulder, and said, "I've said what I wanted to say just now." Old Ma was a little angry, and said, "You bastard, why do you also learn from those officials, only saying half of what you want to say, and acting mysteriously? Can't you just tell me clearly?" Lu Chen smiled, and said, "The secrets of heaven can't be revealed, otherwise it would seem that I'm not smart enough. Besides, if I say something wrong, won't I be even more embarrassed? It's just right now." Old Ma rolled his eyes, and said, "After you return to the immortal city, you've learned bad things." Lu Chen laughed, and seemed to be in a very cheerful mood. This was one of the rare times that he looked happy recently. He told Old Ma, "You go to White Lotus's house first, and help me check on her situation. Her injuries are very troublesome. In any case, she has been with us for a period of time, and we should help her as much as we can." Old Ma nodded, and said, "I will go, but what about you, aren't you going? Lu Qin said, yes, I have something to do, I have to go to the Heavenly Law Hall. Old Ma was startled, and said, Heavenly Law Hall? What are you going to do there? Lu Qin said, to find Immortal Tiehu, I have something to tell him. Old Ma frowned, and wanted to say something, but stopped. Lu Qin nodded, and said, I know, I have already told this matter to the damn Baldi, and he also agreed. Old Ma nodded, and the expression on his face clearly relaxed. Although he still looked a little curious, and really wanted to know what Lu Qin was going to do with Immortal Tiehu, in the end, he actually suppressed his curiosity, and turned away without saying a word. Sometimes, in this kind of Vanity Fair, the less people know, the longer they might live. Lu Qin understood Old Ma's intention, and also felt a little emotional, because in the past 10 years, his life was actually similar to that of Old Ma. But after all, it was different now. He walked alone to the other side of Tianlong Mountain, and met a lot of people along the way. When they saw him, many people had different expressions on their faces, but they were all relatively polite, either because of his high position, or because of Immortal Tianlan's tyrannical strength. Even if they thought that he was not going to live long and had fallen out of favor, they were still polite to him. Otherwise, why would you be angry with a dying person? So along the way, Lu Qin actually felt that his status on Tianlong Mountain seemed to have improved a lot unconsciously. After arriving at the Heavenly Law Hall, he asked someone to let him in, and before long, someone welcomed him in. When he walked outside the main hall of the Heavenly Law Hall, he saw a beautiful woman standing at the door of the main hall, looking at him calmly from afar. Her appearance was charming and tender, like a blooming spring flower, and her beauty surpassed all others. It was Song Wenji. Chapter 627. Seeing Lu Qin coming over, Song Wenji gracefully walked down the stone steps to welcome him. She had a polite and joyful smile on her face, making people feel as if they were bathing in the spring breeze. Lu Qin also went up to greet her. Everyone looked at each other and smiled. The atmosphere was very harmonious and warm. Song Wenji smiled and said, when I heard the news just now, I didn't dare to believe it. I specially asked again before I dared to believe that it is young Master Lu who has come to visit. Lu Qin also smiled and said, Miss Song, you are too polite. I don't deserve it, I don't deserve it. Song Wenji said, this is not something I said casually. Anyway, in my memory, you have never come to Heavenly Law Hall. Today is really a rare guest. Lu Qin said politely, sorry to disturb you, I have a small matter to visit Immortal Tiehu. I wonder if he has time to see me. Song Wenji said, yes. But now my adoptive father has some urgent matters on hand and can't come out to see you for the time being. Lu Qin was startled for a moment, then nodded and said, I didn't expect such a coincidence. Then I will find another time to visit Immortal Tiehu. Song Wenji, however, waved her hand and said indifferently, that's not necessary. I have already gone in to help you inform. Although adoptive father can't leave for the time being, it is not a big deal. Just wait for an hour and it will be fine. He asked me to come and greet you first. Wait for a while in the main hall of Heavenly Law Hall. He will come out in a while. Lu Qin hesitated for a moment, then nodded and said, in that case, I will have to trouble Miss Song. Song Wenji took a deep look at him and said with a smile, young Master Lu, you are treating me like an outsider. With our relationship, this is nothing. After saying that, she turned around and made a gesture of invitation, then led Lu Qin into the main hall. Lu Qin followed behind her, looking at the back of the woman from the corner of his eyes. He had some doubts in his heart. Although he and Song Wenji had interacted with each other recently, it was impossible for their friendship to be very good. Even if they had a good relationship, there were still the two supremes standing behind them. Based on the hostile atmosphere between the two deity transformation realm lords, Tian Lan and Tai Hu, even if the two juniors wanted to befriend them, they would have to be cautious. It could even be said that the fact that they did not turn against each other and become mortal enemies was already a sign of politeness. Song Wenji brought him into the main hall of the Heavenly Law Hall. Of course, it was also Lu Chen's first time coming to this place, so he looked around curiously. In fact, as one of the most powerful places in Mount Tianlong and Zhengxianmeng, this main hall was basically on par with the Kunlun Palace. In terms of history, the main hall of Heavenly Law Hall was even older and more profound than the Kunlun Palace in Fuyunji. After all, Fuyunji was founded by Lord Tianlan, and it only rose rapidly in recent years. In the past, there was not such an unruly force in Zhengxianmeng. The nobles that were deeply rooted in the hearts of the people were the Heavenly Law Hall, the Starry Palace, and the Dezayuan. They were considered to have been the tripod of power since the early days of the establishment of Zhengxianmeng. Their power was intertwined and their potential could not be underestimated. Therefore, the heavy sense of a long history was also reflected in this main hall. Lu Chen saw many tall and magnificent murals on the walls of the main hall here. The murals depicted either ancient legends or some heroes and legendary lords from thousands of years ago. The sense of vicissitudes of history, the sense of heaviness, and even the sense of excitement that made people yearn for it arose spontaneously. These things could not be felt in the Kunlun Palace at all. Although in terms of size, the scale of the Kunlun Palace was much larger than the main hall of Heavenly Law Hall, and the architecture was extremely luxurious and grand. At a glance, one could see the typical style of Lord Tianlan, unscrupulous, arrogant, and the most powerful in the world. He wanted to suppress everyone in the world, even if it was a main hall. In the main hall of Heavenly Law Hall, there was no exclusive lotus throne like that of Lord Tianlan, which was as high as the seat of God or Buddha. At most, there was a large and luxurious chair placed in the center of the main hall, and the rest were ordinary tables and chairs for receiving guests. These things were not complicated. It only took Lu Chen a blink of an eye to see them clearly. Naturally, he had the same feeling in his heart. In fact, it would be fine if he did not come here because he felt that Lord Tianlan's Kunlun Palace was magnificent and looked down upon the world. However, when he came to this place with such a long history, he suddenly had a dangerous thought that it could not be a nouveau riche, that damn Baldy doesn't look like a person without a background. Even if we go back to the past, his master, Lu Chen's grandmaster, Lord Tianhong, was also a peerless lord who was famous all over the world and was a famous inheritance. In terms of connotation, there seemed to be few in the world that could be more profound than Lord Tianlan's. Why did that damn Baldy give himself the temperament of a nouveau riche? Lu Chen thought and criticized in his heart. Of course, he could not show it on his face. He followed Song Wenji all the way to the seat and sat down. Someone had already served them good tea. Then Song Wenji dismissed the others, leaving only the two of them in the huge hall of Heavenly Law Hall, which seemed a little empty. "Young Master Lu, we meet alone again," Song Wenji said to Lu Chen with a smile after taking a sip of the immortal tea. Lu Chen almost choked on the tea in his mouth. After a moment of hesitation, he put down the teacup in his hand and said seriously, "Miss Song, I don't understand what you mean. We didn't specially meet alone, did we?" At the same time, Lu Chen was secretly vigilant. Although his eyes did not move, he secretly glanced around the hall with his peripheral vision, but did not find anything. Just at that moment, there was a faint warning in his heart. This was a kind of inexplicable premonition. There was no evidence to speak of, but it was unknowingly possessed by him when he was lurking in the devil cult in the past in that extremely dangerous situation. Like a lonely wild wolf, cautiously facing the world full of dangers. In a secret corner of the Hall of Heavenly Law Hall, separated by a thick wall, at this moment, Immortal Tiehu, who was supposed to be dealing with a small but urgent matter and therefore could not leave to make Lu Chen wait for a while, was sitting in a secret chamber behind the wall. There was a strange mirror shimmering with a strange light. It was unknown what kind of strange ability had been set up on it, but it actually reflected the scene of Song Wenji and Lu Chen sitting across from each other in the hall. Not only was the image extremely clear, even their voices were transmitted here without a single error. Immortal Tiehu looked indifferently at Lu Chen on the image, listening to his words. Although Song Wenji did not notice, he could tell that Lu Chen was observing the surroundings. His white eyebrows twitched, then he suddenly sneered and said to himself, he is indeed a top-notch shadow master. He can actually detect my presence. He pondered for a moment, then suddenly picked up a piece of jade and said in a deep voice, ask him why he is here. In the image, Song Wenji's body paused for a moment, then smiled at Lu Chen and said, young Master Lu, today you specially came to find my Ifu, what is it for? Chapter 628. At that moment, Lu Chen's heart suddenly skipped a beat. Although Song Wenji in front of him looked normal, he still felt that this woman seemed to have paused for a moment. However, that moment was too short. Perhaps it was an illusion. Therefore, Lu Chen did not show any more hesitation. After a smile, he said frankly, actually, before I returned to the Immortal City, I met a person. He asked me to pass a message to Immortal Tai Hu. I came here today to pass this message. There's nothing else. Pass a message? Song Wenji seemed to have not expected Lu Chen's reason for coming here. She was startled for a moment. After a while, she smiled and said, to be able to trouble Immortal Tian Lan's only disciple, young Master Lu, to pass a message, this person's identity must be extraordinary, right? Lu Chen nodded and said with a smile, it's all right. However, I feel that a person who is qualified to talk to someone like Uncle Master Tai who shouldn't be too bad. That's true. Song Wenji seemed to have thought of this as well. She laughed in a self-mocking manner, and then her charming gaze swept across Lu Chen's face. Her expression was gentle like ripples of water as she said softly, then who exactly is this person? I wonder if young Master Lu can tell me. Lu Chen thought for a moment and said seriously, Miss Song, it's not that I want to be disrespectful to you. However, the person who entrusted this to you did not say that his name can be passed on to others. How about this, when Uncle Master Tai who arrives later, I will report this matter to him and then leave. As for how he will deal with this matter, I can't be a busybody. He smiled and said, when the time comes, you can ask Uncle Master Tai who. With the close relationship between you and your daughter, and Uncle Master Tai who's love for you, I believe he will tell you everything he knows. Song Wenji's expression changed slightly, not because Lu Chen didn't want to tell her the identity of the messenger, but because the man in front of her mentioned intimate relationship, love, and other words in his last words. Perhaps she was paranoid, or perhaps she thought too much, but she felt that it was a little harsh, as if Lu Chen was referring to something else. But when she looked carefully at Lu Chen's face again, she found that this person's expression was the same as usual, and the tone of his voice had not changed at all. There was no sarcasm in his words at all. Could it be that he was thinking too much? There were some things that would leave a guilty conscience in one's heart. Even if one was wearing a warm and soft skin, one would still be afraid of being mentioned. For some things, even if one had an excuse, one would still feel ashamed. It was like the deepest wound that couldn't be healed, always dripping with blood as it cut into his heart. Just a touch would cause him pain. Some people would become numb to the pain after a long time, slowly getting used to it. Then this kind of thing would no longer matter to him, and the wound would slowly be covered up. But there were also some people, although everything was so outstanding on the outside, but their hearts could never pass that hurdle, and would sink into this painful abyss for a long time. Song Wenji stared at Lu Chen, her eyes bright, sharp but no longer clear. Lu Chen felt it, and also raised his head to look at her. After a while, he asked softly, Miss Song, what's wrong? Song Wenji was silent for a while, shook her head and said, nothing. Ha 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 ha. When the tea in the cup was slightly cold, a burst of bright and clear laughter suddenly came from the depths of the Hall of Heavenly Justice. After hearing this voice, Lu Chen and Song Wenji both stood up and turned to look in that direction. After a while, Tiehu Supreme walked over with vigorous steps, in high spirits, full of energy, as if he had encountered some happy event, and was very happy. Along the way, he waved to Lu Chen, and said with a smile, Little Lu, it's rare for you to come to my place, a rare guest, a rare guest. Lu Chen revealed a respectful expression, bowed politely, and then said with a smile, I have some matters to attend to, and have disturbed Shibua's cultivation, it's really a sin. Tiehu Supreme waved his hand indifferently, then walked to his throne and sat down, and signaled for Lu Chen to sit down and talk. And at this time, Song Wenji smiled and personally went to serve tea, poured a cup for Tiehu Supreme, and changed the tea for Lu Chen. After Lu Chen thanked Lu Chen, Tiehu Supreme looked especially gentle and kind today, and said to Lu Chen with a smile, "Little Lu, if you have time in the future, come visit me more often, don't stand on ceremony." To be honest, among all the disciples under the immortals in Zhengxianmeng, I think you are the most promising, the others don't look like they will be able to achieve anything. Lu Chen was shocked, and quickly stood up, and said with a smile, "Sherbua, you flatter me, I don't deserve it. Many senior brothers in the immortal allies have been famous for many years, their cultivation is profound, and their prestige is great. I am still far from them." Tiehu Supreme snorted, and said, "But they are all useless, what's the use?" He looked at Lu Chen, and said with a smile, "But you are different, Brother Tianlan has the most sharp eyes in the world, those who can be chosen by him must be outstanding geniuses." As he spoke, he sighed, and continued, "To think that our Hall of Heavenly Law will have no successor in the future, this old man is truly disappointed." When Lu Chen came here, he never thought that Tiehu Supreme would have such a high evaluation of him, he was really caught unprepared, and didn't know what to say for a moment. Of course, he would not take the words of this big boss seriously, but he secretly criticized in his heart, thinking that these immortals of Huashan realm were all as cunning as old foxes, too difficult to deal with, and he would be fooled if he was not careful. After praising Lu Chen, Tiehu Supreme did not even ask Lu Chen why he came, but just smiled and said to him, "By the way, how is your master these days, is he well?" Lu Chen was slightly shocked, and at that moment, his mind involuntarily had some thoughts, but he immediately replied, "Thank you for your concern, Sherbua. Master is in good health. Before I came here, he asked me to send his regards to you." Tiehu Supreme's eyes slightly narrowed, and then he nodded, his expression seemed to be a little lighter, but he was still very polite to Lu Chen. After a few more words, he asked Lu Chen, "Little Lu, what brings you here today?" Lu Chen secretly heaved a sigh of relief, thinking that after going through so much trouble, he finally got to the point. At the beginning, he said a lot of things in a roundabout way, which always made people feel that there was a hidden meaning in his words, as if he was trying to get information from him. He coughed, stood up, and said seriously, "Yes, the thing is, before I returned to the immortal city, I once passed by the great snow mountain in the lost land." As he said this, his eyes stared at Tiehu Supreme, carefully watching the change of expression on the face of this immortal of Huashan realm. As expected, when he mentioned the three words, Great Snow Mountain, Tiehu Supreme's expression suddenly changed. It really was him. Lu Chen's heart calmed down, and then he said, "In the Great Snow Mountain, I actually met an ancient divine beast, Heavenly Wolf. It was this divine beast that asked me to pass a message to you. It only said, 'The leaf that I borrowed years ago, it is time to return it.'" After saying this, his eyes lit up, and he looked directly at Tiehu Supreme, wanting to see how he would react. Chapter 629. White Lotus put on a coat and sat by the window, staring blankly at the scenery outside the window. Although it was called a scenery, it was actually just a sky with a few trees. Of course, there was a beautiful scenery on Sky Dragon Mountain, but it was not here. Generally speaking, the best places would be taken by the most powerful true monarchs. The house was very quiet, without a sound. Originally, there was a black dog lying outside the house. Even though there was a door between them, they could occasionally hear its movements. Perhaps it could even give people a sense of life. But now that Atsu had been taken away by Lu Chen, the house was completely deserted. White Lotus held her chin with her hand, and her eyes seemed to be a little blank. Perhaps it was because she was too lonely in this lonely and deserted environment, so there was even a little emptiness in her eyes. No one knew what she was thinking at the moment. Was she recalling the past, thinking about some doubts, or simply sitting there in a daze? After an unknown amount of time, suddenly there was a sound of footsteps coming from outside the house, approaching the door from afar. After a while, someone knocked on the door. It was old Ma's voice. "White Lotus, are you in the house?" White Lotus slowly turned her head and glanced at the door. After a while, she said, "The door is not locked. Come in by yourself." There was a moment of silence outside the door, and then there was a creak. Old Ma pushed the door open and walked in. The tall black dog followed him into the house. Old Ma swept a glance around the room before his gaze finally fell on Bai Lian, who was sitting by the window. A smile appeared on his face as he asked, "Why are you sitting up? Is your body feeling better?" White Lotus smiled, but her eyes fell on Atsu, who was standing next to Old Ma. Unlike Old Ma, who was looking around when he came in, Atsu stared at White Lotus as soon as he came in. The eyes of a person and a dog met in midair. After a moment, White Lotus looked away and said to Old Ma, "I'm fine, and I've been lying down for a long time. I want to sit up." Well, Old Ma didn't think much of it. He walked over and moved a chair to sit down. "Lu Chen is busy, but he still remembers you, so he asked me to come over and see if you are better. If there is anything you need my help with, just tell me." White Lotus shook her head and said, I'm fine." Old Ma moved his fat body on the chair and asked curiously, "How did you get hurt? Why did you suddenly cause such a big trouble? Can you tell me?" White Lotus glanced at him and asked, "Didn't Lu Chen tell you?" Old Ma was stunned for a moment and said, "No." White Lotus said, "It seems that he doesn't keep everything from you." After a pause, she looked at Old Ma, whose face was a little gloomy, and said lightly, "Actually, I don't know. I only remember that I followed Lu Chen to the underground city, and then I lost consciousness. I can't remember what happened after that, but when I woke up, I was probably here." Oh. Old Ma didn't say anything more. Or perhaps he wasn't particularly familiar with this girl, so he didn't have anything to say. After dawdling for a while, the atmosphere became a little awkward, so Old Ma quickly found an excuse to get up and leave. However, just as he was about to leave the room, he suddenly stopped in his tracks as if he had something to say. White Lotus felt his movement and looked over. Old Ma hesitated for a moment and said to White Lotus, "Lu Chen isn't a bad person, at least he's a good friend. He's done everything he can for you. Don't blame him." White Lotus stared at him for a moment, and her expression gradually eased. She nodded and said, "I know." Old Ma chuckled and turned to leave. Suddenly, he heard White Lotus say, "Actually, you're also a good friend. Does Lu Chen know that?" Old Ma paused for a moment, but he didn't look back. Then, he walked out of the door and left. Atsu followed him and left. When he left, he looked back and stared at White Lotus fiercely and vigilantly. It seemed that the relationship between this black dog and this girl was always inexplicably tense. Old Ma and Atsu left after the somewhat routine greeting, and the room quickly returned to its original cold and cheerless state. White Lotus walked over and closed the door. After thinking for a moment, she locked it. Just that when she silently turned around, preparing to walk back to the bed, her vision suddenly blurred. Just behind her, in this cold and lonely room, a huge and tall figure suddenly appeared, like a mountain peak standing behind her, and then looked down at her from above. It was a huge and burly bald man in a loose robe. Just by standing there quietly, he already looked like a god. This room was surrounded by walls, and probably only connected to the outside world through the window and the door. But judging from the size of the door frame, it was impossible for this bald man to enter and exit freely, not to mention the smaller window. How did he enter this room? How did he manage to stand behind White Lotus without a sound? At that moment, White Lotus felt goosebumps all over her body. Her face turned pale and her body began to tremble. It was as if she had subconsciously taken a step back, wanting to escape from this place, but in her panic, this indifferent and emotionless true Lord Tianlan suddenly stretched out his hand. His movements did not seem fast, as if he was calmly extending his hand to greet her. However, White Lotus's eyes were filled with despair. Her entire body seemed to be bound by an invisible force, trembling uncontrollably. She watched helplessly as the hand reached for her face, and then, as if it was teasing her, grabbed her chin, and lifted it up a little. She seemed to have lost all the strength and courage to resist when facing true Lord Tianlan. Her whole body trembled, and her face was lifted high. There was even a look of fear in her eyes. True Lord Tianlan looked at her with great interest. He stared at her for a while, thought for a moment, and then nodded. "You seem to be very afraid?" he calmly asked White Lotus. This sentence sounded very gentle and quiet, not like the cruelty of an old cat catching a mouse. But White Lotus seemed to be even more afraid. Her body trembled and she couldn't speak. True Lord Tianlan didn't seem to care about this at all. His thick fingers caressed White Lotus' delicate and fair face as if he was touching a rare treasure. After a while, he suddenly smiled and said to her, "The method of blood food originated from the southern border barbarian witchcraft which had been passed down for a long time. Later on, those trash of the devil cult took it and slightly improved it. It looks like it can be used, but in fact, there are a lot of hidden dangers in it. It looks scary and powerful, but in fact, it's a broken thing that can't even be shown in public. You actually treat this thing as a treasure?" he said with a smile, looking at the girl in front of him like a wolf. Chapter 630. White Lotus's face had lost all color. It was unknown whether it was because her body was too weak after the injury or because she was too frightened at this moment. Her body trembled violently. It seemed that she wanted very much to retreat and escape from Supreme Lord Tianlan's terrifying palm. However, all her strength seemed to have left her at this moment, making her like a pitiful and helpless ant. She could only wail in despair in the giant's palm, unable to even struggle. The world was always like this. The law of the jungle had long become the norm. Even some gentle and compassionate people would unknowingly follow this rule. We revere and worship the strong, despise and ignore the weak. Perhaps we would occasionally pity those who were in miserable circumstances, but in fact, we forgot that most of the compassion was not in our hearts. Out of sight, there were even more weak people who were not seen. Perhaps after seeing them, everyone was used to it. Even those who were kind-hearted couldn't think of mercy. They were like lions that were strutting with their heads held high, and would never look at ants that were trampled to death by their feet. How could there be compassion? Or rather, could there really be compassion in the heart of a person like Supreme Lord Tianlan? White Lotus looked at him mournfully, her eyes full of fear and pleading. It was a fear that came from the depths of her soul. It was her body's instinctive desire to live. She wanted to live. She did not want to die. For this, she could give up everything and give up everything. Her eyes clearly and plainly expressed her thoughts, but Supreme Lord Tianlan was not moved. Perhaps to a giant like him who had stood at the peak for too long, these so-called desires and the so-called price to pay were just a joke to him. He threw them away like they were old shoes. He did not care about them at all. Of course, there were things that he valued, but they were not on White Lotus. Therefore, he smiled coldly and ruthlessly. After a trace of disgust flashed across his eyes, he probably saw what he hated about the devil cult and touched the thread in his heart. His palm slowly moved down from White Lotus's chin. White Lotus's body began to tremble violently. She could clearly feel the rough skin brushing past her smooth neck before stopping in the middle of her neck. The bald giant looked at her indifferently. The giant palm that seemed to be able to destroy everything began to slowly tighten, violently and forcefully squeezing out all the aura in her body. Her heart received the painful reflex of her body and became angry. It began to beat violently, desperately trying to transfer the dark red blood to her head. However, when it reached her neck, it was as if it had encountered an impenetrable dam, and it stopped moving. White Lotus's feet went soft, and then she was in the air. Her body had already left the ground. She was grabbed by the neck and raised into the air. Her vision began to blur, and her feet began to kick wildly. Before the last bit of sober consciousness disappeared, White Lotus sadly found that she was actually too afraid to attack this person in such a situation. But he couldn't do it either. The aura of life was rapidly fading, and the world gradually darkened. Her mind gradually became blank. At a certain moment, a song from a long time ago suddenly echoed in her mind. It seemed to be a song related to the albizia flower. She wanted to sing, but she couldn't. She didn't know why, but some fragmented images suddenly flashed through her mind, like fragments of memories that had long been lost. In that daze, she seemed to see a kind woman hugging her and kissing her. White Lotus desperately wanted to see that face clearly, but it was always blurred. Suddenly, a huge black shadow fell from the sky, took everything away, destroyed everything, and smashed the only figure that she felt warm into pieces. Then, like a mountain, it turned around and slowly walked towards her. Her vision went black, and she fainted, completely losing consciousness. The room was quiet. True Lord Tianlan indifferently looked at the girl in his hand who was slowly lowering her head. With the last bit of strength left, he could completely destroy this budding life. As long as he used a little more strength on his fingers. As long as he tightened the gap between his palms. Even he himself knew that he didn't need to go through so much trouble from the beginning. He could have easily crushed this woman with a finger, instead of torturing people like those trash from the devil cult. But he still didn't do it immediately. He suddenly felt that he was a bit like a member of the devil cult. This thought made True Lord Tianlan a little unhappy, but he still didn't let go. At this moment, a sudden sound of footsteps came from outside the room. A moment later, a familiar voice came in. It was Lu Qin. White Lotus, are you okay? True Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment, then he threw White Lotus away like throwing a rag. With a bang, White Lotus's body fell unconscious and fell to the ground, knocking over a table and making a loud noise. The outside of the room instantly quieted down. But what followed was not the expected scene of someone breaking the door and entering. Instead, it was silent, as if Lu Chen's voice was just a hallucination of the wind and no one had come here at all. True Lord Tianlan tilted his head and glanced at the door. Then, his eyes slowly swept across the wall, sweeping across some unknown places on the wall. The corners of his mouth suddenly revealed a trace of a smile, as if his mood had suddenly improved, as if he had seen something that he liked and was satisfied with. He quietly stood in the room, gazing at the surrounding walls, and then patiently waited. At the corner of the wall about 7 feet away from the door, there was suddenly a very soft sound. It was so soft that it was almost inaudible, as if someone had carelessly touched the wall. But True Lord Tianlan's eyes were already one step ahead of it, staring at that place. He stood quietly. If he wanted to, perhaps he could make it so that not a single trace of his aura leaked out. He could turn invisible and empty, or he could transform into anything, making people think that it was a table, a chair, or a bed and not arousing any suspicion. But he didn't. He just smiled and looked at the corner, casually not controlling his own aura. The sound in the corner instantly went silent. Like a vigilant wolf that had sensed some unknown threat in the darkness, even though there was an urgent bait in front of him, he still forced himself to endure it. The sound outside the room quieted down, followed by a faintly discernible killing intent. Inside the room, True Lord Tianlan's eyes became increasingly bright. His gaze began to drift again, looking at the 4 walls, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. It seemed that no matter how the person outside the room moved, they could not escape his perception. And that terrifying aura locked the person outside the room, making that killing intent thicker and thicker, as if it was about to explode. Chapter 631. It was quiet inside and outside the house. The only thing that could be felt was the invisible tension that was getting tenser and tenser. Supreme Lord Tianlan was still as calm as the ocean. Other than scanning the surrounding walls and following the occasional strange and light sounds that came from outside the house, he did not do anything else. However, the murderous aura outside the house was getting stronger and stronger. It was like the raging waves of an enraged ocean, each wave stronger than the one before it. The invisible waves seemed to be rising higher and higher, as if they would rush into the house in the next moment, drown and destroy everything here. However, the house was still there. The waves of almost hallucinatory murderous aura filled the surroundings but did not cause any substantial movement. Standing in the house, Supreme Lord Tianlan suddenly lowered his head and took a look. The wide sleeves of his robe fluttered slightly even though there was no wind. The admiration in his eyes grew stronger and he even nodded slightly. At the same time, the murderous aura around him had almost reached its peak inside and outside the house. It was as if a huge wave had rushed up to the sky and gathered into an incomparably huge peak. Just as it was about to crash down and explode all the forces in the house, time suddenly seemed to freeze at that moment. All the murderous aura suddenly disappeared completely, as if someone had woken up from a dream. Everything was just an illusion and disappeared without a trace. At the moment when the heavy hammer was about to fall, at the moment when the violent force was about to explode, everything suddenly disappeared. It was really quiet outside the house. There was no sound, no movement, not even the invisible murderous aura. Everything became empty as if nothing had ever existed. It was as if what happened just now was just an inadvertent illusion of Supreme Lord Tianlan. The house was still very quiet. White Lotus was still lying on the ground, and it was unknown whether she was dead or alive. Supreme Lord Tianlan was still standing there alone. His wide sleeves made him look up to him like a majestic mountain. His expression was still calm, without any shock or sorrow. Of course, there were no emotions like fear or dread. However, the smile on his lips faded, and the gratification and admiration in his eyes faded. He stared at the wall. Although there were bricks in the way, it seemed that he could still see through it. Even though he was a deity transformation stage perfected cultivator, at this moment, he could still clearly feel the terrifying difference. The violent moments suddenly turned into nothingness. It was a power that seemed invisible but could affect the soul. It was a level beyond the imagination of ordinary cultivators. It was a rare and profound will to reign in the horse at the edge of life and death. He was indeed the most outstanding shadow. In the end, he still remembered that the shadow's greatest strength was not the vastness of the raging waves, but the soundless glimmer of light in the dark shadows. He lurked in the shadows. When he was not in sight, he was always indescribably terrifying, even for a soul formation perfected cultivator. Yes, at this moment, perfected Lord Tianlan truly felt threatened for the first time. That was the disciple that he admired the most, trusted the most, and had placed the highest hopes on. He was a good disciple that he had personally taught. His gaze was somewhat cold. Lu Chen, who was outside the house, had used some weird secret method to completely conceal his aura like a ghost at this moment. Supreme Lord Tianlan could feel that Lu Chen should still be somewhere outside the house, but for the first time, he lost control of Lu Chen's exact location. This was a very rare thing for him. Of course, this was also because he had secretly suppressed his own cultivation. He was an extremely powerful person. As long as he released his senses without any scruples, it was almost impossible for anyone near him to hide their traces. However, under such a powerful and magnificent aura, ordinary cultivators might not be able to sense it, but in the eyes of the shadow, who had gone through special and harsh training, he was like a blazing sun. It was impossible to hide his identity. However, he still did not want Lu Chen to know that he was here at this moment. He was still a little curious about this disciple of his. He wanted to know what kind of abilities and trump cards this man, who had many fetters with him and appeared to be gentle and respectful but was actually arrogant and unruly in the depths of his heart, had. He really wanted to see. Therefore, he still stood quietly and waited patiently, waiting for the shadow to strike with the breath of death that he did not know when would come amidst the silence. For a moment, a somewhat strange thought suddenly flashed across his mind. He thought of many years ago in that desolate valley, when the ancient magic formation was activated by the elders of the devil cult, and when the shadow that had been hiding for many years appeared behind them and delivered the final fatal blow. What did those people feel? Would there be a day when he would also experience such a state of mind? He waited patiently, as if he did not care about life or anything else, and was only left with curiosity. The silence outside the house seemed to last for a very long time, but it also seemed like a blink of an eye. In that tense and empty atmosphere, there seemed to be an invisible force constantly attacking one's mind and perception, constantly producing all kinds of illusions. Then, after the silence that made one feel lost and silent, suddenly, a voice rang out from somewhere on the wall. It was extremely soft, almost the same as before, as if someone had touched the wall with his fingers. There was almost no sound at all, except for a terrifying figure like Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze instantly shifted over. At that moment, his perception was immediately magnified, and almost in the blink of an eye, he caught the breath that had suddenly disappeared. His lips curled into a smile again, and his expression became gentle once more. He looked like an adult looking at a stubborn child who was playing around, with a bit of affection. However, at this moment, suddenly, on the opposite wall from where the voice had just come from, the wall that Perfected Lord Tianlan's back was facing, a sound also rang out. Pa! It was extremely soft, and almost inaudible, except for figures like Perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression instantly froze, and he almost subconsciously looked back with a bit of astonishment. However, when he turned his head halfway, he frowned, as if he had sensed something, and his body suddenly froze. At that moment, it was as if the world had stopped, and time had frozen for a moment. Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure stood alone in the house. There seemed to be a gust of wind blowing outside the house, and in the house with its doors and windows tightly shut, his large sleeve seemed to flutter slightly. Time was like a surging river, and someone was faintly looking at him from the depths of the river. In the crack of time and space, the bald man also seemed to be looking sideways, staring at the place where the invisible light and shadow intersected. He seemed to be looking at himself, but it also seemed like it wasn't him. Perhaps it was just his past and future self, who knew? Then, he suddenly raised his head, as if he had beaten time to it. The moment his head turned, it was as if a force had suddenly shattered the piece, completely destroying the disorderly illusion, making the bald man seem to have beaten time to it. He raised his head and looked over. Boom! A loud sound rang out, and dust flew everywhere. The two walls that had echoed the sound were fine, but above his head, there was a huge hole in the roof. Someone descended from the sky, and his killing intent was like a tide, bursting forth violently. With a suffocating momentum, he went straight for his head. Chapter 632. It was as if a stormy sea had rolled up a raging wave, crashing down from above. The sound of the wind was so strong that it seemed as if the house was about to be torn apart. The violent wind blew everything in the house to the left and right, even White Lotus, who had fainted on the ground, was blown away a few times. The wind rolled up into a whirlpool, whistling and surging. However, in the eye of the storm, the tall and burly man still stood there. Although his sleeves were also fluttering, his body was towering and unmoving. His face was calm and indifferent, and his gaze seemed to be deep and distant, hiding an unknown emotion. In the fierce wind, Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up at the sky. His pupils reflected the figure descending from the sky. That figure was very familiar. The violent storm blew his clothes, but it could not shake his body in the slightest. However, for some reason, his body, which was as heavy and solid as a mountain, did not move an inch at this moment. In that moment of life and death, he still quietly raised his head and looked up, without the slightest movement. It seemed that he was caught unprepared. Or was he waiting for death? Or was he helpless? The storm was like a wild horse that had escaped its reins, wreaking havoc in the house. The murderous shadow hidden behind the fierce wind had not hesitated at all from the beginning. As soon as it rushed into the house, it immediately pounced on its target, using the fiercest killing move with the fiercest murderous intent. The storm that filled the sky seemed to have become its follower, whistling and converging into a fearsome and terrifying force. In the depths of the shadow, Lu Chen's face was faintly discernible. His whole body was like a sharp blade, stabbing straight down. The black dagger that he once owned was now gone. It had been destroyed by Perfected Lord Tianlan. Now, there was a strange black fire flashing on Lu Chen's body. Even his eyes seemed to be burning with two balls of fire. In the blink of an eye, the two men seemed to be very close to each other. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked up, as if he had not reacted to the fatal attack that was falling from the sky and could split his head open. Lu Chen was majestic and boundless, but at that moment, he finally saw the person below clearly. The bald man. The man who was looking up. Should he really continue with this attack? Would this strike be the only chance in his life to kill this damn Baldy? The darned Baldy was so powerful and terrifying that it was almost impossible for one to reach the soul formation perfected Lord realm through hard work alone. What better opportunity could there be than this? In a one-on-one battle, he seemed to have the absolute upper hand. He saw perfected Lord Tianlan's face. It was so short that he didn't even have time to judge whether this person was at a loss or not. Or was it just a trap, a test? Once again, a fork in the road of life appeared in front of him. He had to make a choice. If he made the wrong choice, he would fall into the abyss and die without a burial. The wind howled, and that moment seemed to last for an eternity. Supreme Tianlan stared at the figure descending from the sky. Looking at the familiar face in the shadow behind the storm, he wondered if he would stab him with a fatal blow. He remembered that morning many years ago, when the sun was very warm, he found the boy in the alley and took him away. That morning, he held the boy's hand. Although the boy was usually fierce and cunning, he was very obedient that day. Maybe he had that special ability since he was young, or maybe life had taught him survival skills. If he had to die, was it also a reincarnation and karma to die in the hands of the child he had taught? Those secrets hidden in his heart would probably disappear forever. There was even a smile on his lips. He squinted his eyes and looked at the murderous figure in the air. Then, he made eye contact with the man in the wind. At that moment, he actually felt that time was very, very slow. Then, he suddenly heard a muffled groan from the sky. The wind suddenly whistled mournfully, but the murderous intent in the storm suddenly dissipated. Then, he clearly saw Lu Chen's face suddenly change from the condensed murderous intent to a hint of surprise, and then suddenly turned red. It was as if all the blood in his body had suddenly rushed to his face and head. His body fell rapidly from the air and suddenly twisted in an extremely twisted position. Then, Lu Chen's whole body flew out. While he was still in midair, Lu Chen's body made a few deep cracking sounds, as if a few of his bones had been forcibly broken by a powerful force. Immediately after, his body suddenly arched, his head jerked back in midair, and he spat out a mouthful of blood. A moment later, with a boom, Lu Chen's body heavily smashed into the wall beside him. In an instant, the bricks of the wall cracked and dust flew everywhere. The house also trembled and made rustling sounds, looking like it was about to collapse. Perfected Lord Tianlan silently stood where he was, his eyes fixed on the figure struggling under the messy ruins. A light flickered in the depths of his eyes. After a moment, he slowly walked up to Lu Chen, who was lying on the ground and coughing violently with his hand on his chest. There was a painful expression on Lu Chen's face. Anyone who had a few bones broken and had their meridians devoured by an extremely fierce force would not feel good. If it were an ordinary person, he would probably have fainted by now. But Lu Chen did not. He panted heavily and finally calmed down a little. Then, he raised his head and looked at perfected Lord Tianlan who was standing silently in front of him. After a moment, a smile suddenly appeared on his bloody face. Then, with a hint of mockery, he scolded, "F***ck off, damn Baldy." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at this young man and opened his mouth. It seemed that even someone as wise as him did not expect to hear such words at this time. For a moment, he did not know what to say. But for some reason, he was not angry. On the contrary, his gaze even softened a little. He squatted down his tall and burly body and approached Lu Chen. After a moment of silence, he looked at his face that was stained by blood and dust and said, "You must have wanted to scold me for a long time, right?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "Yes, since the day you threw me into the devil cult." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. He reached out and patted Lu Chen's shoulder. Then, he casually lifted Lu Chen up and threw him on his back. Lu Chen let out a muffled groan as if he had hit a sore spot. His body trembled, but apart from this sound, he did not say a word and endured it. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not say anything else. Just like that, he carried Lu Chen and walked out of the room, leaving the ruins behind him. He did not even care about the White Lotus who was lying in the dust, dead or alive. Just like that, he left this place with his only disciple. A line of warm blood flowed down his lapel. He looked down and said, "Your blood is still warm." Lu Chen leaned on his shoulder. His breath sounded weak and painful. After a while, he said, "Of course." Chapter 633. Perfected Lord Tianlan did not hide his tracks when he left. It seemed as if nothing had happened as he walked calmly as if nothing had happened. Of course, he was carrying the pale and haggard-looking Lu Chen on his back. After he walked out of the door and took 5 or 6 steps forward, a sudden roar came from behind him. It sounded like a cry of despair, or a sigh of frustration. Then, there was a cracking sound. Dozens of cracks appeared on the brick walls of the house and spread rapidly. Then, with a loud roar, the whole house collapsed. Dust and gravel flew into the air. It was a rather spectacular sight. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan did not even turn back to look. He just walked calmly and slowly. Such a huge commotion naturally alerted the surroundings. Moreover, this was Fuyunji's territory. As the most vigilant and powerful hall in Zhengxianmeng, the people here moved the fastest. Not long after, many people rushed out of the surrounding houses. Some of them looked vigilant, some of them were disheveled. It was unknown what they were doing in the houses. Further away, more people were rushing over from all directions. The expressions of the people who were the fastest to arrive were the first to change, looking extremely shocked. They immediately stopped and stood to the side. Some of the more impatient ones who arrived later shouted angrily, "Who is so bold? How dare you?" When he saw the scene in front of him clearly, he choked on his words as if he had eaten a raw duck egg. He looked shocked and took a few steps back, looking as if he had seen a ghost. More and more people appeared in the surroundings and then quietly stood to the side to watch. At the same time, a strange emotion also spread in the crowd. None of the people here were fools. They only believed what they saw with their own eyes. Lu Chen, young Master Lu, was injured for some unknown reason. However, Perfected Lord Tianlan did not care about bloodshed and personally carried this disciple. They were like father and son. The rumors that had been secretly spreading in the past disappeared at this moment. Their relationship seemed to be unbreakable and indestructible. If there was a need to choose a side, there was no longer any need to think about it. Everyone consciously kept a distance from Perfected Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen and looked at the master and disciple with complicated feelings. At the same time, many people secretly looked in another direction. Perfected Lord Tianlan walked forward. His body was tall and sturdy, but his steps were unusually steady. At the same time, Lu Chen suddenly heard his deep and sonorous voice. "I've destroyed that black sword. Now that I think about it, it's a pity." Lu Chen raised his head slightly and glanced at him without saying a word. Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and said in a low voice, "Perhaps he can really injure me." Lu Chen closed his eyes. Perfected Lord Tianlan was not offended. He thought for a moment and said, "How did you manage to make a sound on 2 walls at the same time when you were outside the house?" Just as Lu Chen was about to say something, the two of them suddenly sensed something and turned to look at the collapsed house together. They saw a stone being pushed away from the rubble. Then, a black figure jumped out and stood on the spot, shaking with all its might. Immediately, a cloud of dust rose. It was Black Dog. Lu Chen did not say anything, but Perfected Lord Tianlan smiled and nodded. "This dog is not bad." Lying on Perfected Lord Tianlan's shoulder, Lu Chen walked through the crowd. Suddenly, he saw a familiar figure standing in the crowd not far away. The person was looking at him with surprise and a little doubt. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment. Then, he waved at the fat man and said, "Old Ma, come here for a moment." In the crowd, Old Ma was startled. The people around him immediately dispersed, leaving him alone. Old Ma smiled awkwardly and had no choice but to walk forward. Apparently, perfected Lord Tianlan had no intention of stopping for Old Ma and continued to walk his own path. Even if Old Ma was 10 times more courageous, he would not dare to argue with perfected Lord Tianlan. Therefore, he could only blindly follow behind perfected Lord Tianlan. Then, he slightly bent down and approached Lu Chen. With a sad face and a little nervous, he said, "My little ancestor, what are you doing?" Lu Chen coughed and pointed to the back. Then, he said, "White Lotus is still in that house. She was buried under the rubble. Although I don't know whether she is dead or alive, you can go and have a look." Perfected Lord Tianlan did not look back, but at this moment, he slightly raised his eyebrows. Old Ma was stunned for a moment. No one knew what had happened in that house. However, when he peeked at perfected Lord Tianlan, he found that this big shot had no intention of saying anything. Old Ma could only grit his teeth and nodded to Lu Chen. "I see." Lu Chen hummed in acknowledgement. He seemed to still be a little worried, so he added, "If she's dead, we'll bury her. If she's still alive, we'll try our best to save her. After all, she's someone we know." "Oh," Old Ma agreed. Then, he turned back and strode toward the house. Perfected Lord Tianlan walked a few steps forward with Lu Chen on his back. Suddenly, he said, "Just an acquaintance." Lu Chen said, "That's it." "Okay." Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded expressionlessly. Then, he left with Lu Chen on his back. After the two protagonists left, the surrounding crowd gradually dispersed. Only Old Ma was left standing in front of the pile of collapsed houses, speechless for a moment. He stood there for a moment and looked around. However, he found that no one came over. It seemed that everyone was very smart and did not want to get involved in this matter, which was likely to cause trouble for them. Therefore, he was the only one who was unlucky. Old Ma sighed and lowered his head to turn over the broken stones and bricks. Next to him, Atsu probably saw that Lu Chen was carried away by perfected Lord Tianlan. It stayed where it was and did not follow Lu Chen. It was probably because this dog had always been in awe of the bald perfected lord and was unwilling to approach him. However, even if it stayed where it was, Atsu obviously had no intention of helping Old Ma. It took a few steps to the side, jumped on a stone, and lay on it. Then, it lazily watched Old Ma work like a laborer. Although Old Ma was fat, he was still a cultivator and had some cultivation. Therefore, he worked much faster than ordinary people. Soon, he turned over a lot of broken bricks and found White Lotus lying in a cloud of dust. Looking at White Lotus lying on the ground, covered with dust, Old Ma was shocked and hurried to check her breath. After a while, a warm breath came from his fingertips. Old Ma heaved a sigh of relief. Then, he stared at the girl whose beautiful face was mostly covered by dust, shook his head, and said to himself, "You also have a hard life. In fact, it's very tiring to live, but who wants to die?" When he said the last sentence, his voice was very soft, as if he had been touched by something. Chapter 634. If Zhangxianmeng was the most powerful organization in the world and gathered the greatest power in the world, then the Immortal City and the Celestial Dragon Mountain were the biggest stage in the world. On this incomparably huge stage, for thousands of years, scenes of joys and sorrows of the human world, countless plots of power and intrigue had happened here. There were even more treacherous and strange things that happened in the dark places where the sun couldn't shine and were not known by most people. It was like a pagoda of slaughter stacked layer by layer. Everyone had their own position and height, and they could only know things at their level. However, there was one thing that everyone understood and knew. The higher they went, the higher they stood, the bigger the things they knew and the greater the benefits they could obtain. No one was willing to be ordinary. In the Immortal City, the world's largest Vanity Fair, the most realistic and most yearning tower of power, everyone desperately wanted to climb up. Mediocre people who had no desire to struggle, no perseverance, and no ambition had long been swept away here. In this huge city where everyone preached justice, fairness, and benevolence, there were actually not many people who really believed in these beautiful words. Lu Chen did not believe in these beautiful words. He came from the outside world that was a little dark and shadowy. In the beginning, he always felt a little out of place with this bright city, but later on, everything changed for the better. One of the best things about Vanity Fairs in the world was that the people here would always look up to those who stood at the top and worship them, even if they knew that one day in the future, they might personally kill and rob those dazzling treasures that people coveted. However, as long as their strength was not enough, as long as their ambition was not big enough, they would be filled with fanatical worship for power. People take the preferences of those who stand at the top as their preferences. They look up to those in power. People imagine that their lives must be far beyond their imagination. In people's world, power is the only standard. Lu Chen was an outsider. In the beginning, many people did not like him. He seemed to be out of place in this huge city where fame and fortune ran amok. But perfected Lord Tianlan showed him what real power was, and made Lu Chen understand what kind of power he was facing. Unexpectedly, the bald true immortal decided to take Lu Chen as his personal disciple. He was the only one who had ever accepted Lu Chen as his disciple. Then, he solemnly held a grand and unprecedentedly grand apprenticeship ceremony. All the powerful people on Mount Celestial Dragon, who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world in the Immortal City, came to the scene to support this young man who became rich overnight. From a nameless shadow, a down-and-out man that no one cared about, he had become a hot young talent in the true Immortal Alliance in one go. He was a strong contender for the position of power in the true Immortal Alliance in the future. He held great power in his hands, and he could even faintly stand up to that woman from the Floating Clouds Agency. The charm of power could be seen from this. Lu Chen was a smart man, even smarter than many people. After getting this rare opportunity, he immediately grasped it tightly and began to change himself. He adapted to the rules of this huge city and learned all kinds of things in this Vanity Fair. He learned very quickly. Of course, this could be attributed to having a good teacher. Even though his feelings for the damn baldy true monarch Tianlan had always been so complicated, it could never change the fact that true monarch Tianlan was a man of great talent and strategy. Even Lu Chen had never wavered in his respect for true monarch Tianlan's strength after so many years. What had wavered in his heart was actually the matter of trust. No one wanted to be perfected Lord Tianlan's enemy, including Lu Chen himself. After perfected Lord Tianlan took Lu Chen away from that room, the atmosphere on Sky Dragon Mountain seemed to be quiet, which lasted for quite a long time. This was actually quite rare for Zhengxianmeng, which had always been surging with undercurrents and fighting for power and profit. So much so that everyone secretly muttered in their hearts, could it be that there is a big conspiracy happening in some dark corner that I don't know about? This was a matter of life and death. Not knowing what was going to happen, in this huge Vanity Fair, it was simply a sin deserving of death. It might be the best opportunity to climb up, or it might once again remind those who were at a loss that their level was not high enough. Because he had a good master, Lu Chen's level was forcibly raised by a lot in a short period of time. This was an opportunity that countless people were extremely envious of. Correspondingly, he knew much more than ordinary people. Because there were some things that only perfected lords of Huashan Realm knew. And now, perfected lords of Huashan Realm were telling him secrets that could make people crazy. I'm going to do something big. Perfected Lord Tianlan said to Lu Chen when there were only the two of them in the main hall of Kunlun. His expression was solemn and resolute. At the same time, he was gentle and kind to Lu Chen. It seemed that this time he had really made up his mind to completely trust this disciple and was going to share all his secrets with him. Lu Chen could clearly feel this mood of the damn baldy, but he was not too surprised. Instead, he felt his heart was heavy and even a suffocating dizziness. What a big thing that a perfected lord of Huashan Realm, or even a perfected lord of Huashan Realm like the damn baldy, who was arrogant and looked down on the world, would be talking about something big in such a serious manner. It would probably pierce through the sky. With a polite smile on his face, Lu Chen thought to himself. Then, he heard what perfected Lord Tianlan said next, I'm going to set up a trap to kill the other old farts in Zhengxianmeng. The smile on Lu Chen's face suddenly froze, and his mind went blank for a moment. Then, in the shortest time possible, he thought about which people in Zhengxianmeng were qualified to be called old farts by perfected Lord Tianlan, and how many of them were worthy of being carefully plotted against by the damn Baldy instead of directly crushing them with his insufferably arrogant strength. The final answer was surprisingly simple. It was so simple that Lu Chen's mouth became dry. Then, from his heart to his mouth, there was only one word left: lunatic. Are you crazy? Lu Chen stared at the damn Baldy, took a deep breath, and then said with some difficulty, "You want to kill that kind of people, and several of them?" Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and replied with a Then, he looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "What do you think? Am I very powerful?" Lu Chen looked up at the magnificent dome of the palace of Kunlun and let out a long breath. Then, he struggled to persuade and said, "How about we take it slow and kill them one by one?" Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered and waved his hand, saying indifferently, "Too troublesome." Chapter 635. There was no way to reason with a lunatic. There was a sense of powerlessness in Lu Chen's heart, and he had a deeper understanding of this truth. But very quickly, he discovered that he actually had a little bit of confidence in this madman's crazy plan, and he was even curious about what this crazy Baldy would do next. One is marked by the company one keeps. Will a person who gets close to a Baldy also go crazy? Lu Chen composed himself and scolded himself in his heart. Sitting next to him, Supreme Tianlan seemed to have thought of something and said to Lu Chen, "By the way, when you went to the Heavenly Law Hall to find the old man Tiehu and told him about the leaf, what was his reaction?" Lu Chen's originally drifting thoughts were pulled back by these words. He thought for a moment and recalled the situation at that time. He opened his mouth and said, "After true Lord Tiehu heard what I said, his expression was obviously shocked at that time. However, he quickly regained his composure and revealed a disdainful expression. He didn't say much to me and finally nodded his head and said that he understood." Supreme Tianlan thought for a while and nodded. "That's enough." Lu Chen didn't understand him and couldn't help asking, "What do you mean?" Supreme Tianlan waved his broad palm in front of him, and several of his fingers seemed to be unconsciously flexing and stretching. He glanced at Lu Chen with some complicated emotions in his eyes. It was neither anger nor joy, but a little perplexity. Yes, emotions such as confusion and hesitation were very rare for a person like perfected Lord Tianlan, but he still revealed them at this moment. Lu Chen also noticed this, and he was a little puzzled for a moment because this didn't seem like the person he knew. Or rather, Lu Chen himself had rarely seen such emotions from this damn Baldy in his past interactions with him. However, Supreme Tianlan didn't hesitate for long. He seemed to have made a decision very quickly. He looked at Lu Chen with a smile and began to explain to him. The moment Supreme Tianlan opened his mouth, Lu Chen suddenly understood something. This person could have ignored everyone in the world, but now he was willing to patiently explain his feelings to him. It seemed that he was really willing to treat himself as one of his own. There was no more estrangement or suspicion between them. To outsiders, they were master and disciple who were as close as father and son, but in fact, they could feel that there was still a distance between them, just like a river or a ditch between them. That ditch and the river were actually not wide and could be easily crossed. However, the two men always stood on his side and did not take the initiative to take the step. It was a very subtle and complicated emotion that involved so many years of ups and downs, and also related to the most basic bit of trust between them. Until this moment, Lu Chen suddenly felt that Supreme Tianlan seemed to have suddenly decided not to wait and was willing to take the initiative to accept him. What made him suddenly decide to give up all his worries and really trust him? Lu Chen thought of the blow he struck his head in Su Qingjuan's room. What Taihu said, "At least he didn't deny that Yi is now in his hands," Supreme Tianlan said lightly. Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, "It's enough to know this. In the future, we'll think of a way to snatch that thing from him. Snatch something from the hands of a divine transformation realm perfected cultivator." Lu Chen smiled bitterly and tried to get used to this way of speaking. Then, he frowned and asked, from what you said, it seems that the fragments of the divine tree of the devil cult are very important to you? Supreme Tianlan seemed to have suddenly established a firm trust in Lu Chen. He nodded and said, "That's right. Although these items are evil, they are the only treasures in the world that possess the legendary power of the gods. They are of great use to me." Lu Chen looked a little solemn. It seemed that he felt complicated and uneasy about these few devil cult items. He raised his hand as if he wanted to touch something, but he quickly put it down when it was halfway to his chest. He frowned and said to Supreme Tianlan in a low voice, "I don't know what you want to do, but these items belong to the devil cult after all. It may be okay to keep them secretly, but if you take them out and use them, I'm afraid there will be a lot of criticism." Supreme Tianlan looked calm and said, "It's okay." Seeing his determined expression, Lu Chen didn't try to persuade him anymore. However, his expression was still solemn as if he was under a lot of pressure. After a while, he asked Perfected Lord Tianlan, "1 branch, 2 leaves, and 1 seed. Do you need to get all 4 pieces of the divine tree?" Supreme Tianlan hesitated for a moment before saying, "That's not it. Of course, it's best to have all 4 for the greatest effect. However, if you have at least 2 leaves, it should be barely enough." He paused for a moment before adding, "Out of these 4 fragments, the seed has the strongest spiritual energy and is much stronger than the other 3, so if I only have 1 seed, I will be able to use it. Otherwise, I will need at least 2 leaves." Lu Chen fell silent. After a while, he let out a breath of turbid air and said softly, "But you only know that there's a leaf in the iron kettle now, right?" "No." Supreme Tianlan suddenly sneered and said with a solemn expression, "I have a second one." Lu Chen's body shuddered and his expression changed starkly as he raised his head and looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. Atsu, who was in the courtyard, suddenly raised its head and looked in the direction of the top of Sky Dragon Mountain. It seemed to have sensed something at that moment and looked over with a hint of worry. But perhaps it was because the feeling was still fleeting, or perhaps it was because the distance was too far that even Atu wasn't too sure. So after a while, Atu quietly laid back on the ground again. This was the old house at the horse-washing bridge in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City. The house on the mountain collapsed and Old Ma was entrusted by Lu Chen to look for White Lotus. He found the girl in the rubble and realized that she was still alive. The atmosphere on the mountain was a bit weird, and the identity of White Lotus became more and more awkward. It was obvious that Supreme Tianlan carried Lu Chen out of that house and then the house collapsed, but he did not care about White Lotus at all. This bald Supreme's attitude was very clear. If Lu Chen, who was on the back of Supreme Tianlan, had not told Old Ma in public, Old Ma suspected that he might not have been able to carry White Lotus down the mountain safely. But even so, Old Ma felt that there might be many eyes staring at them outside the house at this moment. Women are really troublesome. Old Ma looked at the beautiful girl lying on the bed in the house and sighed with emotion. Although he did not know whether this White Lotus had made a mistake or touched the bottom line of Supreme Tianlan, it should not be a secret that Supreme Tianlan did not like this person, or perhaps he would prefer her to be dead. Why couldn't Lu Chen understand this? Old Ma shook his head and was ready to leave. But just as he was about to leave, he suddenly glanced at White Lotus out of the corner of his eye and saw a faint green light suddenly flashing. Old Ma was stunned for a moment. He took a step forward and found a strange green twig-shaped chain around White Lotus' neck. He did not know when it had slipped out, but it seemed to be stimulated by something. The small twig was shining brightly, as if something was coming back to life. Chapter 636. Old Ma suspiciously stared at the strange necklace exposed on White Lotus's fair skin. The faint green light flickered silently. The light was very gentle, not dazzling, and did not seem to have any dangerous aura. Instead it carried a faint vitality of life. But Old Ma could still vaguely feel, in this branch-shaped thing, there seemed to be some fragility, or it should be said, a little like a person who was out of breath. Of course, exactly what was the specific situation, Old Ma also did not dare to easily make a conclusion. After all, he had never seen this thing before, just that right now his expression seemed to have turned solemn after the initial shock. All these years, although Old Ma's reputation was not prominent and he did not make any world-famous achievements, but in fact in these 10 or 20 long years, he had always stood together with Lu Chen at the forefront of the battle against the evil sect. Although what he did was the most inconspicuous and most secretive kind of work, but in fact his position was exceptionally important. If Lu Chen in that period of time was said to be the shadow who dived into the deep waters, fighting with the bloody shoals of fish in the dark shadows, then Old Ma was the only tube that Lu Chen could breathe through from the suffocating water surface. And it was precisely because of this, with Lu Chen's unyielding and suspicious mind, despite the ups and downs over the years, Old Ma to him, was still the most trustworthy and most willing to get close to person. This was a friendship that had been honed in those despairing and painful years, experienced the test of life and death and blood. For shadows like them, trust was the most extravagant emotion. One must know, Lu Chen even once suspected that tallest figure. To be able to gain Lu Chen's trust and survive for so many years in the underground dark world fighting against the evil sect, Old Ma of course could not be a useless person, and even more could not be a person who knew nothing about the evil sect. On the contrary, his understanding of the evil faction was definitely one of the top few in the world. There was an old saying, the person who wanted to understand you the most must be your enemy. Based on Old Ma's knowledge of the evil sect, when he saw the branch-shaped chain, a word suddenly flashed across his mind, divine tree. Yes, although the 4 divine weapons of the devil cult were secretive, people like them definitely knew about them. However, because of his different identity from Lu Chen, Old Ma had actually never seen the 4 pieces of the so-called 1 branch, 2 leaves, and 1 seed of the divine tree. Whether it was the legendary treasure or not, Old Ma really did not dare to draw a conclusion. Furthermore, no matter what, White Lotus was the last disciple of a deity-stage true monarch of the Kunlun party. How could the devil cult's divine weapon be with her? This possibility was a little unimaginable, but Old Ma still stared at the chain. After a moment, he slowly took a step forward and stood in front of the seemingly unconscious White Lotus. He seemed to be hesitant, but in the end he still stretched out his hand and gently touched the chain. There were too many things in this world that seemed impossible. Some were like the collapse of heaven and earth, some were like the vicissitudes of the world, and some were things that people firmly believed would not happen. For example, parents were always loving, even a vicious tiger would not eat its cubs, or lovers were always faithful, would not separate and would not betray, and there were also people who firmly believed that the person they trusted would not stab them in the back. Old Ma had lived for so many years and watched the dark world behind the light. Other than the collapse of heaven and earth and vicissitudes of the world, he had seen everything else. He knew that in this world there was nothing that was eternal and unchanging. Many times it was just a kind of fantasy and illusion that people were willing to believe in. At that moment, when his fingers were about to touch White Lotus's fair neck, his heart suddenly tightened, as if he had sensed some kind of danger. But at the same time in his heart, a thought that he had thought of a long time ago flashed past. That year in that desolate valley, when Lu Chen betrayed those evil cult teachers and stabbed the black blade into their backs, those evil people probably also had this kind of absurd thought. Perhaps it was because these few years he had finally left the front line of the battle with the evil cult, this fatty who was once vigilant still had some slack. So much so that his state of mind at this moment suddenly became careless. He did not notice that in this close proximity, White Lotus, who was lying on the bed, suddenly clenched her fists. In his eyes, there was only that faint green light, in his mind, there was only the voice of the evil cult treasure echoing in amazement. Lu Chen was once a shadow, he had stayed in the world's most dangerous and treacherous evil cult for 10 years, he had seen many things, encountered countless dangers and unimaginable accidents, but in the end he had survived them all, until today. Therefore, right now he actually rarely had that kind of huge emotional fluctuation, because when he encountered an unexpected accident, he would often instinctively suppress his shock and quickly calm down, start to judge the direction of the situation and then decide what he should do next. This was a very important reason why he was able to live till today, because this kind of invisible ability was too hidden, so sometimes he even needed to show panic when he was not panicking, in a calm situation, make himself look very anxious, as if he was about to lose control. Of course, he was also human, he also had weaknesses, even someone as calm and cold as him, these few years there were also times when he lost control of his emotions. And every time he lost control of himself, someone would die in his hands. On this day, in this Kunlun palace, Lu Chen revealed a shocked expression, but this time it was not an act, he was really shocked. He was so surprised that he even stood up and stared at Supreme Lord Tianlan. Supreme Lord Tianlan seemed not to care about Lu Chen's loss of composure, or perhaps he had already expected it. He did not say a word, only smiled, and gently rotated his fingers. Both of their gazes landed on perfected Lord Tianlan's hand. His finger, which had been empty previously, now had a small object. It was a piece of green, full of life. This was a leaf without branches to rely on. This was a leaf without a foundation. However, it was different from the leaves in the world that quickly withered after leaving the trunk and branches. This leaf was filled with the aura of life and spiritual power. The power was so abundant that it even gave people the feeling that this leaf was directly absorbing energy and spiritual power from the space around it. The emerald green light encircled the leaf, as if announcing its identity. Lu Chen did not need to think carefully to know the origin of this thing. There were only 2 such leaves in the world. They were both evil, legendary treasures of the evil devil cult, and this was one of the only 2 leaves left in this world by the Tree of God. Where did this come from? Lu Chen raised his head, looked at Supreme Lord Tianlan, and asked word by word. Chapter 637. Lu Chen could be said to be one of the most knowledgeable people in the world about the 4 mysterious fragments of the Tree of God that had been passed down in the devil cult since ancient times. Among the 4 fragments, the seed was undoubtedly the most powerful and the most important one. In the Battle of the Desolate Valley, the 3 elders of the devil cult and the fire shaman of the barbarian tribe directly activated the spiritual power of the seed and activated the most powerful god-subduing spell formation of the devil cult since ancient times. It was almost a heaven-defying thing. Of course, in the end, they failed at the last step. This was also the reason why the devil cult hated the shadow called Black Wolf and the initiator Fuyunji to the bone. They hunted them down and took revenge for many years. Although there were countless bloody stories in the process, it was undeniable that the Battle of the Desolate Valley had really hurt the foundation and vitality of the devil cult. In addition, there was a gathering of the righteous here. Zheng Xianmeng had many outstanding talents, and there was even Supreme Tianlan, a peerless figure with great talent and bold vision. In the end, the devil cult, a sect with a long history, was finally completely destroyed. In addition, Lu Chen actually knew the whereabouts of the 4 treasures that many people could not figure out. The most important seed of the 4 fragments of the Tree of God was hidden in his body. It merged with his body and became that strange and mysterious ancient tree whole space. He had seen the branch of the Tree of God before. Strangely, it was on White Lotus. But when he entered the tree hole of the Tree of God, Lu Chen clearly felt that the tree hole formed by the seed seemed to have absorbed a large part of the spiritual power essence from the branch and changed the shape of the tree hole. Because of this, he did not try to snatch the branch from White Lotus. Part of the reason was that the situation was very delicate at that time, but the main reason was that he felt that he did not need the branch. The last 2 leaves were unknown to him. Although he occasionally encountered some clues over the years, it was not until recently that he was sure that one of the leaves was actually in the hands of Supreme Tiehu of Zheng Xianmeng. As for the last leaf, he really did not know the whereabouts of it. He knew 3 of the 4 treasures and had the most important one or even 2. No one in the world knew this secret except for himself. He thought he had basically mastered this secret until he suddenly saw the leaf in Supreme Tianlan's hand. Sure enough, there were always unexpected things in this world, and this perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to always be able to do things that others couldn't. He was always giving people a shock or a surprise. Where did this come from? The first thought that popped into Lu Chen's mind was that this crazy baldy couldn't have suddenly run over to the Heavenly Law Hall last night, killed Tai Hu, and then snatched his leaf, right? Without a doubt, this idea was completely unreasonable and filled with madness. It was a ridiculous fantasy, but Lu Chen soon discovered that he actually didn't dare to completely rule out this possibility. However, Lu Chen soon found that he did not dare to completely rule out this possibility. This kind of scalp-numbing thing happened to this damn Baldy. He stared at Supreme Tianlan and clenched his teeth hard. Supreme Tianlan's expression looked much calmer and gentler. He even looked a little happy, as if he was very gratified by Lu Chen's shocked expression. He smiled and said to him, "How is it? You didn't expect me to have this treasure, did you? Did you get a shock?" Lu Chen took a deep breath and nodded heavily. "Yes, I was almost scared to death." Supreme Tianlan laughed and suddenly flicked his finger. The leaf flew into the air and then floated lightly toward Lu Chen. Lu Chen's heart suddenly jumped and his body tensed up almost subconsciously. His eyes were fixed on the leaf. He could even feel a sudden violent vibration in a certain part of his body. To be honest, at this moment, Lu Chen was really afraid. He was afraid that the seed hidden in his heart would sense this leaf and then do something that he could not control. After all, for so many years, Lu Chen had almost no control over the tree hole formed by the seed other than himself, who could enter and exit the mysterious tree hole, even if he had used up all the immortal water that was once filled with life's spiritual energy. Fortunately, it was unknown whether the seed had a mind of its own, or it did not have a particularly big reaction. After the initial commotion, it quickly quieted down. Even when Lu Chen reached out to take the leaf, the seed did not move at all. Lu Chen heaved a sigh of relief inwardly. He felt that even if he had a tough heart, this kind of repeated torture and fright was a little too much for him to bear. It was probably going to shorten his life. When he held the leaf in his palm, he felt a vaguely familiar feeling. It was the unique aura of abundant life spiritual energy, which he felt when he immersed himself in the immortal water in the tree hole. Based on this feeling alone, Lu Chen could determine that this leaf was real. The damn Baldy had actually gotten his hands on a leaf of the tree of God. He raised his head and looked at the damn Baldy. Although he did not speak this time, the puzzled look in his eyes had already revealed his meaning. At the same time, there was a more complicated meaning. He did not speak, but perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be able to read his mind. He chuckled and folded his arms in front of his abdomen, saying, "Don't guess blindly. Although the old man Tai who is unbearable, he is after all a perfected lord of the divine transformation realm for many years. How can he be so easy to kill? This leaf is not the one in his hand." Lu Chen nodded silently. In his heart, he thought, as expected. This world is still considered normal, although it seems to be almost full of lunatics. He calculated in his heart, and his eyes fell on the leaf again. He thought, is this the fourth and last fragment of the tree of God that has been missing for a long time? He held the leaf lightly, then returned it to perfected Lord Tianlan without changing his expression. He said, "If it is not perfected Lord Taihu's, then this is." His voice suddenly paused as if he suddenly thought of something. In his memory, the damn Baldy did not have any fragments of the tree of God. Moreover, he knew the whereabouts of the other 3 fragments and could not have been taken away by him. In other words, the damn Baldy most likely obtained this leaf recently. What happened recently? What could possibly be related to this divine weapon fragment? The answer was almost obvious. Lu Chen closed his eyes slightly. He felt that his throat was a little dry, and a strange and complicated expression appeared on his face. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him with a smile and a deep gaze. He said, "Have you figured it out?" Lu Chen sighed and said, "I didn't expect it to be with him. Actually, I should have thought of it long ago. Apart from him, there is no one else." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. He walked over and patted Lu Chen's shoulder. He said with a smile, "This is all thanks to you. It can be said that it did not take me any effort to get it. With this, as long as I find the other fragment, there is no need to worry about failure. Heaven is helping me." Chapter 638. It was the leaf carried by Elder Ghost. To be honest, although this answer was a little abrupt, it was not too surprising after thinking about it carefully. As the last leader of the devil cult who had the power to rally people, Elder Ghost undoubtedly controlled the last resources of the devil cult, including those unspeakable secrets. The shards of the tree of God to the evil sect was the most sacred holy object, just that after thousands of years of changes in the world, the 4 shards had also scattered. Lu Chen knew that 3 of the shards' exact whereabouts were no longer in the hands of the evil sect people, then the last leaf was still in the evil sect, still hidden in Elder Ghost's hands. It was actually a very logical thing. However, it seemed to have benefited perfected Lord Tianlan. He followed Lu Chen to the underground city and met Elder Ghost. He killed this old rival who had been fighting with him for decades and took a piece of leaf. Even Lu Chen could not help but marvel at the luck of this damn Baldy. He muttered in his heart, "Is this the luck of the current number 1? It was originally extremely difficult to kill Elder Ghost and find that piece of leaf." In the end, perfected Lord Tianlan only followed him to the underground city and settled everything in one go. If it was not for the fact that Lu Chen knew that he was the one who first encountered those strange things in the underground city and that he was the one who brought perfected Lord Tianlan down, he would really suspect whether all of this was a conspiracy planned by perfected Lord Tianlan himself. Even when perfected Lord Tianlan sent him back to the surface, it was also his intention to kill and rob. In any case, everything was in the past now, and it was a foregone conclusion. Lu Chen had nothing more to say. In any case, at least for now, this person before him was truly unparalleled in the world, unstoppable, and even the heavens were on his side. Although this guy was a lunatic, but a lunatic who was lucky and capable, Lu Chen felt a little pain in his teeth again. Now we just have to wait for the last blood sea anomaly to appear in the sky. When that time comes, it will be the moment when the blood moon's aura reaches its peak and also the time when our plan starts to be implemented. It seemed that perfected Lord Tianlan had complete trust in Lu Chen, even though Lu Chen himself was surprised by this kind of treatment. However, he had never been able to figure out what perfected Lord Tianlan was thinking, so he could only let nature take its course. But to be honest, who in the world could really see through perfected Lord Tianlan? Blood moon. The last time the blood sea phenomenon will appear. Although Lu Chen had not heard the complete so-called plan from perfected Lord Tianlan, he still quickly and keenly grasped a few key points in the damn Baldy's words. Just as he was about to ask in detail, perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly frowned as if he had thought of something. He muttered to himself, that's not right. Lu Chen was stunned for a moment. He saw perfected Lord Tianlan's hesitation and vigilance at this moment, which was rare for him. He would not act like this unless there was a major event. Lu Chen could not help but ask, "What's wrong?" Perfected Lord Tianlan was silent for a moment. His gaze was deep as he said slowly, "I thought of something. Some time ago, I once asked perfected Lord Guyu of Starry Hall to divine the whereabouts of the 4 pieces of the divine tree of the devil cult. He also performed his divination very carefully and finally told me that there is only 1 piece in this immortal city. The whereabouts of the other 3 pieces are unknown." Lu Chen's heart shook, but he still maintained his composure on the surface. After a moment, he asked softly, "When exactly did he do the divination? Could it be that someone else brought the fragment to the immortal city after he did the divination?" Perfected Lord Tianlan shook his head slowly. The glimmer in the depths of his eyes was dim and difficult to understand. He said, "Now it seems that from the beginning, there were at least 2 of the 4 pieces of leaves in this immortal city. Elder Tai who has one, Elder Gui has another. There are also branches and seeds. It's hard to say if we don't know about it now, but he should have lied to me." Did perfected Lord Guyu lie to perfected Lord Tianlan? Why did he lie? This was a simple question, but the hidden matter was very big. The impact might be even bigger. Lu Chen didn't dare to say more. But now, he actually didn't care about perfected Lord Guyu's intentions. Because he suddenly thought of another thing, perfected Lord Tianlan seemed to be determined to get these pieces of the devil cult's divine weapon. But other than the 2 pieces of leaves, the remaining 2 pieces, namely the branches and seeds, were also in this immortal city. The seeds were right in front of him, on Lu Chen's body. The branches were at White Lotus's side. Everything was actually under his nose. If this secret was discovered by perfected Lord Tianlan, Lu Chen suddenly felt that not only did he have a toothache, but even his breathing started to become a little difficult. Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression looked a little solemn. He walked back and forth in the hall with his hands behind his back. After a while, he turned his head and said to Lu Chen, "This matter has a great impact. We can't treat it lightly. I still have to go and deal with it." With that, he turned and walked out of the hall. Lu Chen subconsciously wanted to say something to him, but he quickly held back. There were some things that couldn't be explained. Even if it was the truth, if others didn't believe it, everything would be as good as nothing and the truth would become false. Perfected Lord Tianlan's figure quickly disappeared outside the hall. Lu Chen slowly walked out. When the sunlight shone on him, he slightly narrowed his eyes and looked up at the sky. The world was bright and the sky was high and wide. There was not a bit of hostility or any trace of the blood sea. Looking at the sky in front of him, it was simply impossible to imagine that it would be covered by the strange blood sea phenomenon. When the blood sea phenomenon appeared again, something would definitely happen, right? Lu Chen didn't have the intention to ask Perfected Lord Tianlan immediately. At least from the looks of it, Perfected Lord Tianlan would tell him sooner or later. But now, he had a more important and urgent matter in front of him. Lu Chen calmed his mind and then strode in the direction of the mountain. Earlier, Old Ma had sent someone to tell him that White Lotus was indeed still alive and that he had dug her out from the ruins of that house. Because of the subtle atmosphere on Sky Dragon Mountain, it was indeed not suitable for White Lotus to continue staying on the mountain. Otherwise, who knew whether some greedy guy would run out and kill this girl and then ask for credit from Perfected Lord Tianlan. Old Ma brought White Lotus to the house next to the horse-washing bridge at the foot of the mountain. Lu Chen decided to go and see her as soon as possible. Of course, this was just an excuse. In his heart, an originally unimportant matter had now become an urgent matter. The branch necklace still hanging on White Lotus's neck suddenly became a very troublesome thing. If the damn Baldy found this thing and came back to ask Lu Chen why he didn't tell him, it would be hard for Lu Chen to explain. Even if he didn't admit that he had seen it, would White Lotus stab him in the back and tell the damn Baldy that she had seen this branch before? Lu Chen felt that it was hard for the damn Baldy not to be suspicious given how much importance he attached to the fragment of the devil cult's sacred tree. What he didn't want to lose now was the damn Baldy's trust in him. He had a vague feeling that in the upcoming upheaval, perhaps the damn Baldy's trust was his biggest reliance. But when he walked quickly down the mountain, he was still a little upset. It was really not easy to deal with White Lotus. That girl seemed to never be really controlled by anyone. How could he make her completely, reliably, and truly shut up? Dead people? As Lu Chen walked in silence, this thought flashed through his mind. Then he was shocked, but then he found that his heart was actually calm. For him, perhaps life and death had long been a numb, cold, and hard thing. He seemed to have really lost the feelings that should have been warm. Chapter 639. In the house next to the horse-washing bridge, Old Ma looked a bit restless. He was sitting on the edge of the bed in the bedroom, and on the bed, White Lotus was still lying there with her eyes closed. Close by, the green chain on her neck was still shining. The house was very quiet, the door was unlatched, and the window was half open. From there, he could see the scenery of the courtyard. From where Old Ma was sitting, he could see the black dog lying under the big tree in the courtyard. It had a lazy and bored look, and its eyes were slightly closed, as if it was going to fall asleep soon. Old Ma felt a bit nervous. He thought that it was mostly because of the importance of the tree branch. As for other things, it was quiet here, there was nothing worth being vigilant about. As for White Lotus, he subconsciously looked down. The beautiful young girl looked like a flower that was about to wither. His hand that was reaching for the branch paused slightly in midair. Finally, he clenched his teeth and touched it. His somewhat stubby fingers reached into the soft green light, causing his body to slightly tremble. But after pausing for a moment, nothing unexpected happened. Old Ma looked at White Lotus, frowned, and then used his fingers to lightly grab the branch. When he touched the skin, he felt a cool water-like chill pass through his fingertips. It wasn't a very stimulating kind of cold, just a feeling that was a bit colder than the temperature of water. Even so, wearing this kind of necklace would definitely not be comfortable, unless one had an innate cold resistance, or if one's cultivation was too high and long ago ignored this little bit of cold. Old Ma used his fingers to gently stroke the lifelike branch a few times. After a moment of silence, his eyes flashed, and he looked down again. White Lotus was still lying there motionless like before, as if she was no longer a threat to him. Everything here was decided by him alone. The light in the depths of his eyes suddenly flourished, as if he had made up his mind. His body slightly leaned forward, and just as he was about to do something, woof! Suddenly, a cry fiercely broke the silence in the bedroom. Even though it didn't sound loud, but in this silence, it was like a sudden clap of thunder, a clap of thunder in the clear sky. Old Ma's body violently trembled, and he staggered, almost falling down. If he hadn't instinctively stretched out his hand to support himself on the bed, he would have been so scared that he would have directly thrown himself onto White Lotus's body. Even so, his unintentional forward movement almost touched White Lotus's body. His face was only a little distance away from White Lotus's face. This really made Old Ma's heart almost jump out of his chest. But luckily, White Lotus still didn't seem to have any signs of waking up, or else this situation would be really too embarrassing. A delicate fragrance from the young girl drifted into Old Horse's nose. It was like an orchid deep in the mountains. Although it was quiet and plain, its fragrance was distant and could stir one's heart. For a moment, Old Ma's gaze actually froze for a moment. He had never looked at a girl at such a close distance, not to mention White Lotus, who was so beautiful that she was even qualified to be the first in a 1,000-year-old family like the Kunlun party. She was supposed to be a high and unattainable woman like a snow lotus, but suddenly, it was as if she was right under his body and close at hand. Old Ma was a little dazed, and his mind suddenly became a little chaotic and blank. He actually forgot what he wanted to do before, and even forgot why the current situation had become like this. But fortunately, although his mind was temporarily confused, there was a dog in the room whose mind was 10 times clearer than his. The black dog, who was not the slightest bit affected by the temptation of beauty, saw Old Ma's inexplicable loss of self-control. After the initial surprise and doubt, it quickly ran over, stood beside the bed, and loudly barked into Old Ma's ear. Old Ma's body trembled, and he cried out in alarm. This time, he was quite frightened, but not entirely out of fear. There was also an inexplicable sense of shame. His body slanted a little, and he jumped up. He took 2 steps back, and then looked at Atsu angrily and said, "You stupid dog, what are you doing? You stupid dog, what are you doing?" Atsu glanced at Old Ma and did not say anything, but the way it looked at Old Ma looked a little strange. Old Horse was not Lu Chen. He did not know the dog as well as Lu Chen did. He could completely understand what the dog meant without saying a word. Therefore, after mumbling a few words, Old Horse still walked over. But this time, he did not dare to do anything more. After a moment of silence, he said to Atsu, "I have a use for that chain." Atsu looked at him, not knowing if it was difficult to determine what he was thinking, but in the end, it still stepped back. Old Ma secretly breathed a sigh of relief in his heart, and then walked to White Lotus. After calming down, this time, without hesitation, he reached out and directly grabbed the chain on White Lotus's neck. Then, with a low groan, he exerted force in his hand, and with a snap, the chain broke. He pulled the branch necklace off White Lotus's neck. When Lu Chen walked to the house at Shima Qiao, he heard Atsu's call from the door. It seemed that they were really here. Lu Chen's heart was relieved. Walking all the way from the door to the backyard, Lu Chen immediately saw Old Ma coming out from the bedroom, and at the same time, Atsu followed behind him. Lu Chen walked over and shouted, "Old Ma, how is White Lotus?" At first, Old Ma seemed to be preoccupied and lost in thought. He didn't even notice Lu Chen's figure appearing on the other side of the yard. Until Lu Chen came over and shouted, Old Ma was suddenly startled. His body shook, and he looked up to see Lu Chen. His face showed a bit of shock and a slightly panicked expression. "Ah, why did you come so quickly? Quickly? Lu Chen asked with a little doubt, and said, it's okay. How is White Lotus? Old Ma hesitated for a moment, turned around and pointed to the bedroom, and said, she hasn't woken up yet, she is lying on the bed. Lu Chen nodded, walked over and patted Old Ma's shoulder, and said casually, I will go in and see her. This time, thanks to you for saving her life. When she wakes up, you have to ask her to repay you. Old Ma was startled, and said, repay what? Lu Chen looked at him strangely, and said, anything, you can say whatever you want to say. Also, you won't really say anything excessive to her, will you? Old Ma thought for a moment, and said, no. Lu Chen laughed, and walked into the bedroom. Behind him, Old Ma looked at his back with a complicated expression, while the black dog stood at the side, looking at Old Ma, and then at Lu Chen, not saying a word. No one knew what the dog was thinking. Lu Chen walked into the room, and immediately saw White Lotus. Then he thought of the troubles he had worried about before, and then his eyes moved down slightly, looking at White Lotus's neck. Chapter 640. Since you're here, I'll go out for a walk and get some fresh air. Standing behind Lu Chen, Old Ma yawned, looking a little tired, and said, I've been locked up here for half a day, it's a little stuffy. Lu Chen sat on the edge of the bed with his back facing him, looking at White Lotus, as if he was carefully observing her expression. After a moment of silence, he didn't turn around, and said in a very flat tone, okay. Old Ma turned around and walked out. Just when he walked to the door and was about to step out, with his back facing Lu Chen, a strange and complicated expression finally appeared on his face. Suddenly, he heard Lu Chen suddenly call out from behind him, Old Ma. Old Ma's heart skipped a beat, and his feet slowly landed on the ground, raising some dust and making a low sound. What's wrong? He smiled and turned around, asking Lu Chen's back. Lu Chen still didn't look back at him, still staring at the unconscious White Lotus lying on the bed, as if all his attention was still on the girl. At the same time, he said to Old Ma in a very flat and casual tone, when you come back later, bring some good wine and dishes. We haven't had a drink together for a long time. Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief, a smile appeared on his face, and he scolded with a smile, what are you talking about? We haven't had a drink because you've made a meteoric rise, haven't you? It's a small matter, leave it to me. After saying that, he seemed to feel a little funny, laughed twice, and strode out. The room was quiet again, and no one knew when Atsu disappeared from this room, and no one knew where he went in the blink of an eye. In such a big house, it gradually gave people a feeling of emptiness, as if in such a big place, only this bedroom had a little vitality left. The anger came from the two people in the room, Lu Chen and White Lotus, who looked like a dead person but was still alive. Lu Chen quietly stared at White Lotus. His eyes looked very calm, and there was almost no strange expression on his face. His whole person seemed very calm and collected. Most of the time, his gaze landed on Bai Lian's fair neck in a strange manner. Even though there were times when he would shift his gaze away to look at other parts of her body in order to check on her injuries, he would quickly turn his gaze back to her. To be honest, it wasn't very polite for a man to stare at a girl's neck like this. If White Lotus was still awake, she would probably get angry. However, she was the one who was unconscious. Perhaps she didn't feel anything from the outside world, so she naturally didn't have any reaction. Lu Chen's gaze gradually became a bit deep and complicated. In this silence, he seemed to be thinking or judging something in his mind, and the expression on his face didn't look too good. After a moment, suddenly Lu Chen stretched out his hand, and this time directly placed it on the side of White Lotus's neck. He carefully touched the edge of her clothes a few times. This action of course was a bit excessive, and even crossed the line. In the midst of this, Lu Chen's fingers even directly touched the soft skin of White Lotus. At the edge of her clothes and even near her collarbone, he continuously pressed a few times, as if he was finally confirming something. After a while, he slowly straightened his body and expressionlessly stood up. He had already obtained his answer. The tree branch necklace that White Lotus used to wear was now gone, and on the originally white soft and even perfect skin, there was a small inconspicuous spot on the side and back of an inconspicuous place, there was a small inconspicuous faint red. It was like the blush that a girl's cheeks would have when she was shy, or as if she had just been lightly shaved. Lu Qin stood by the bed for a while, slightly frowning as he pondered. His hand hung by his side, calm and harmless. From this place, it wasn't very far from White Lotus who was lying on the bed. He only needed to bend down slightly, and this hand could once again return to the girl's neck. The beautiful girl slept quietly, as if she didn't know that there was such a hand beside her that could snap her neck at any time. The room was abnormally quiet, and one could even vaguely hear a strange sound in the extreme silence. It sounded like a person's heartbeat, but when one listened carefully, the sound disappeared, as if it was just an illusion. Lu Qin stood there for a long time. At some point, he suddenly sighed softly, shook his head, and left the bedside. He walked to the door and looked out. Looking at the empty courtyard, he suddenly whistled loudly. The whistle broke the somewhat strange and uncomfortable silence, like a blade piercing a piece of white paper. After a while, a sudden bark rang out. From another corner of the room, the black dog scuttled out and trotted all the way back to Lu Chen's side. Lu Chen smiled. He didn't mind the dirt and sat directly on the doorsill. Then, he hugged Atsu's head and stroked it hard. His eyes flickered as he said, "Stay here with me and wait for old Ma to come back." Atsu looked at him, and then obediently lay on the ground beside him. Lu Chen didn't say anything else. He just sat there and waited patiently. Time passed slowly. The light and shadow in the sky flickered, and the reflection in the room was also constantly changing. In the light and shadow, Lu Chen's face remained motionless like a statue, as if he had hidden all his emotions. Old Ma still didn't come back. When the sky gradually darkened and night finally fell, the house fell into darkness in the silence. Even Lu Chen's figure was swallowed by the surging darkness, but old Ma still didn't come back. Lu Chen had been sitting on the doorsill for a long time. He seemed to be particularly patient today, or perhaps there was an unusual desire in his heart that allowed him to sit there and wait for his friend. The food and wine he promised, the drinks he promised, had yet to come true. The sky was dark, and Atsu had already fallen asleep. There was some snoring, as if it was laughing at Lu Chen's ridiculous persistence. Lu Chen looked up at the quiet night sky, and for a moment, he was also in a trance. He took one last look at the quiet courtyard, stood up silently, and walked back to the bedroom. Bang! He slammed the door. Atsu was still sleeping, and seemed to turn a deaf ear to this sound. Pada, Lu Chen lit a candle in the room, and then walked to White Lotus, who had not woken up until now. He picked up one of her hands and checked it. He found that her pulse was stable, and the injuries on her body seemed to be improving. It seemed that her life was not in danger. What was strange was that the culprit that had been raging in her body, the tyrannical spiritual power, seemed to have been completely cleansed. Although the power of the spiritual power had been greatly weakened, it had completely calmed down and hid quietly in the sea of qi in White Lotus's dantian. It seemed that as long as it was given time, it would even show signs of merging with White Lotus's own spiritual power. This was the effect of the blood food secret method. Lu Chen was well aware of this. He glanced at White Lotus and smiled slightly, but the smile was slightly sarcastic. "I don't know if you heard what the damn Baldy said. He said, 'You dare to eat such a deadly thing?'" Chapter 641. The candlelight burned silently, lighting up the only source of light in the darkness, shining on the two of them. Lu Chen stared at White Lotus, his expression gradually becoming complicated and emotional. Then he casually sat down next to White Lotus and said to himself, "When you wake up, what will you do? The world is big, but there is no place to stand, and you don't want to die. This is probably torture." White Lotus lay motionless and didn't respond to his words. Lu Chen also didn't seem to care. He glanced at White Lotus's neck and then said in a low voice, "Is he the one who took that branch?" The dim candlelight fell on White Lotus's beautiful face and the room fell into silence. After a while, Lu Chen quietly pulled the quilt on White Lotus's body higher and covered her neck. Then he turned and walked out of the room. Lu Chen left the house next to the horse-washing bridge and took Atsu with him when he left. In other words, he left the unconscious White Lotus alone in this dark and uninhabited house. If someone came near, White Lotus would have no way to resist. This method was obviously not very appropriate, but Lu Chen did it. Moreover, when he left, he didn't have the slightest hesitation, as if he wasn't worried about the person in the house behind him. Taking advantage of the darkness of the night, he walked through the long street and the mountain path, returning to Mount Celestial Dragon. Then, he walked all the way to the Fuyun Agency's territory. After glancing at the deep darkness of the night, he calmly walked into the Kunlun Palace where true Lord Tianlan was. In the dead of night, even though it wouldn't matter if Supreme Tianlan sat here for a few days and nights with his cultivation, he naturally wouldn't stay here under normal circumstances. In fact, the security outside the Kunlun Hall was also very tight. Only Lu Chen, with his unique identity, could come and disturb Supreme Tianlan at this time. He entered the hall and at the same time, a message was quickly sent. Lu Chen didn't know and didn't want to know what the damned Baldy was doing at this moment. He only said one simple thing in the message: "There's an urgent matter, come out and talk." When the boy who went in to report left, he looked at Lu Chen with a complicated expression. He seemed to be crying. Even a deity transformation stage supreme wouldn't be in a good mood to be disturbed in the middle of the night. No, it should be said that if a deity transformation stage supreme was angry, that would be even more frightening. Unfortunately, Lu Chen did not respond to his pleading eyes. After entering the hall, he simply sat down on a chair, obviously waiting for perfected Lord Tianlan to come out and speak. The boy sighed deeply and left with a hidden bitterness in his eyes. After a while, the boy ran out of the back hall with an excited expression, as if he had just escaped from death. He smiled and said to Lu Chen, "Young master, Supreme Tianlan will be here soon. He asked you to wait here for a while." Lu Chen nodded and said very politely, "Okay, thank you." The boy grunted and said, "There's no need to be so polite. I just want to trouble young master. We can do anything in the future, but please try not to come here so late at night." As he spoke, he looked at Lu Chen pitifully. Lu Chen felt a little embarrassed under his gaze. He smiled and nodded, saying, "Just this once." The boy went away happily. Not long after, the sound of footsteps was heard. It was Supreme Tianlan coming out of the back hall. Perfected Lord Tianlan didn't look angry at all, as if it was no different from daytime to him. He even smiled at Lu Chen and asked, "What's the matter? Why are you in such a hurry?" Lu Chen had already stood up when he saw him. Without any hesitation, he said straightforwardly, "I may know the whereabouts of the branch of the Devil Sect's divine tree." Supreme Tianlan was startled, as if he didn't expect to hear this news from Lu Chen. He looked at him with interest and said, "You actually know this news? Then tell me." With that, he sat down on a chair next to him and beckoned Lu Chen to sit next to him. Lu Chen didn't intend to sit down. Instead, he stood and began to narrate the matter in the most direct and simple words. In the end, he said, "I guess that the thing on White Lotus's neck should be that branch. I went there today to make a final confirmation, but the branch disappeared when I reached Horsewashing Bridge." Supreme Tianlan's expression didn't change. His eyes were deep. After pondering for a moment, he said, "So you suspect that old Ma took that branch?" Lu Chen said, "There's no one else but him." Most of the people in the world didn't know much about the devil cult, and they had never heard of the highest secret of the devil cult like the fragment of the divine tree. However, old Ma was the same as me. He knew everything about the devil cult. He can recognize that thing and he didn't return for a whole night probably because he was confused by that branch. That's why he ran away in the night. Supreme Tianlan nodded slowly and said after a while, "Since you said so, I naturally believe in your judgment. What's your plan now?" Lu Chen said, "My plan is to find you now and tell you about the matter. You decide how to deal with it. Supreme Tianlan looked at him deeply, a light flashing in the depths of his eyes. After a while, he stood up and walked to the door of the hall. He said indifferently to someone outside, "Call Shuang over right now." Someone outside immediately agreed. Then, there was the sound of disorderly footsteps and someone hurriedly left. Supreme Tianlan looked up at the night sky with his hands behind his back. After a long time, he turned around and slowly walked back to Lu Qin. He said, "Aren't you and Ma Xiaoyun best friends for many years? Why did you do this today?" Lu Qin looked up at him and answered without asking, "Do you think I did something wrong?" Supreme Tianlan thought for a while and said, "No, you did the right thing." He seemed to say it sincerely. "If it were me, I would probably do the same." After saying that, he sighed with a faint disappointment on his face. It was unknown whether it was for himself or for Lu Qin. Some things couldn't be hidden. White Lotus wasn't dead yet. As long as she woke up, this matter would definitely be exposed. As long as she made a big deal of this matter, Supreme Tianlan might realize that Lu Qin might have seen this necklace a long time ago but didn't tell him. When old Ma left the bedroom, Lu Qin didn't look back at him, but he called out to him. At that time, did Lu Qin want old Ma to stay, or did he want him to take the branch and run away? Lu Qin didn't think about this question at all and didn't want to think about it. He didn't want to know the answer. He only knew that old Ma had left him for that very important evil cult treasure. Knowing this should be enough, right? As he thought this, he seemed to feel something at the same time. He looked back and saw Shuang walking in from the door of the hall. But she wasn't alone. What was rare was that there was another person following behind her. This was rare when she came to Supreme Tianlan's place. But soon, the eyes of everyone in the hall lit up and stared at the face of the person behind Shuang. He was a little fat and looked a little familiar. He walked honestly and didn't raise his head. But Supreme Tianlan and Lu Qin immediately recognized that this person was old Ma. Chapter 642. Seeing the two people who had just entered slowly walk over with steady footsteps, the great hall of Kunlun was silent for a moment. Lu Qin looked at old Ma, while True Lord Tianlan turned his head to look at Lu Qin. Lu Qin could feel True Lord Tianlan's gaze on him. He didn't even need to look at the damn Baldy's eyes to feel the astonishment, surprise, and even a bit of mockery in his eyes. He knew what this damn Baldy was thinking. He knew that right now, True Lord Tianlan wanted to preserve some dignity for himself, as well as maintain some dignity in front of Shuang and the others. That was why he wasn't laughing to his heart's content. Although it was soundless, he seemed to be able to hear that laughter. The most inexplicable thing was that Lu Qin actually guessed that this damn Baldy probably knew that Lu Qin could understand his thoughts, so he was pretending to laugh in his heart. This was an inexplicable intuition that didn't make any sense. However, when Lu Qin silently turned his head to look at True Lord Tianlan, and saw this damn Baldy's unprecedentedly serious expression as well as the light that constantly flickered in his eyes, Lu Qin knew that his guess was probably correct. This feeling of telepathy was really embarrassing to the point of wanting to die. Shuang brought old Ma to the front. True Lord Tianlan's sleeves moved slightly as he looked at the two of them. Shuang stepped forward to greet them, and old Ma knelt down as well. True Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change, as if he had suddenly forgotten that he had called Shuang over for an urgent matter. He only nodded lightly and said, "You've come." Shuang solemnly bowed to True Lord Tianlan, then stood up and said with a respectful expression, "My lord, I have a guess as to why you summoned me here in the middle of the night. However, before you speak, I also have an urgent matter to report." True Lord Tianlan nodded and said, "No problem, you go first." Shuang stepped to the side, revealing old Ma's figure. She then said, "Fuyunji's former Shadow Patrol Inspector Ma Xiaoyun has something to report to you." Both True Lord Tianlan and Lu Qin could tell that Shuang had deliberately emphasized the first 5 words in her simple words. She was probably emphasizing her identity. Supreme Lord Tianlan couldn't help glancing at Lu Qin out of the corner of his eye. Lu Qin stood aside expressionlessly, looking as unresponsive as a wooden man. Perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes flickered with a faint smile. Go ahead. Without saying a word, old Ma took 2 steps forward on his knees. Suddenly, he reached into his bosom and took out a box. He presented it to Supreme Lord Tianlan with both hands and said loudly, My lord, by chance, I have recently obtained one of the 4 fragments of the Devil Sect's legendary Tree of God, the Tree of God's branch. I dare not covet such a precious treasure, so I have specially come to offer it to you. His words were resolute and full of vigor, showing his loyalty. Supreme Lord Tianlan seemed to be moved. He nodded and said, There's such a thing. Old Ma said, Yes, the treasure is in this box. Please have a look, my lord. Supreme Lord Tianlan casually waved his hand and the box in Old Ma's hand flew into his. After weighing it in his hand, Supreme Lord Tianlan opened the lid. At that moment, a green light shone out from the box. It flowed and swayed, carrying a strange aura of life. It was a spiritual power that almost no living creature in the world could possess. Legend had it that only the 4 fragments of the Devil Sect possessed it. It was the aura of the Tree of God. Lu Chen recognized that it was the real Tree of God's branch, and so did Supreme Lord Tianlan. At that moment, even with his calmness, he couldn't help but smile happily. He nodded and said, Good, good, good. Little Ma, you have made a great contribution. Old Ma kowtowed and then stood up silently. He walked to Shuang and stood behind her. He lowered his head and lowered his arms, staring at the ground. Lu Chen looked at his old friend with a complicated expression. After a while, he sighed softly. Seeing Supreme Lord Tianlan smiling and playing with the Tree of God necklace in his hand, Shuang also walked forward and said with a smile, My lord, are you satisfied with this treasure? Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and said, Very good. Shuang smiled and pointed at Old Ma. She said, Please tell me, how should I reward this person? Supreme Lord Tianlan chuckled. His eyes flickered as he glanced at Lu Chen. His expression didn't change as he said generously, This item is of great use to me. Little Ma, you have done well and made a great contribution. How about this, from today onwards, Ma Xiaoyun will be promoted to Deputy Hall Master of Fuyunji. He will assist Shuang in managing the affairs of the shadow. This can be considered his old profession. Shuang was slightly startled. She then smiled and nodded in agreement. Old Ma had already knelt down to express his thanks. After a short delay and a few more words, Shuang and Old Ma stood up and left. Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't ask them to stay. However, before Shuang left, she turned around and asked Supreme Lord Tianlan, My lord, you said that you called me over for an urgent matter. I wonder if I still have. She didn't finish her sentence, but there was a questioning look in her eyes and expression. Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed and waved his hand. He said, What urgent matter? It's fine, it's fine. You can go. Shuang smiled like a flower. She nodded in agreement. Then, she left the hall with Old Ma. Before she left, she seemed to deliberately look at Lu Chen. There was a meaningful look in her eyes. Lu Chen was speechless. He only clenched his fists that were hidden in his sleeves. After Shuang and Old Ma left, only Supreme Lord Tianlan and Lu Chen were left in the hall of Kunlun. The atmosphere returned to a somewhat awkward silence. Supreme Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen. He didn't say anything. Instead, he clicked his tongue from time to time. Lu Chen couldn't take it anymore. He glared at him and scolded, What are you clucking at? Look at your gloating face. Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed and pointed at Lu Chen. Are you a good-for-nothing? You don't have many capable subordinates. Now, your most trusted one has run away. Lu Chen was about to retort. Suddenly, he felt a chill in his heart. Although he said it as if he was joking, was there any truth in it? Supreme Lord Tianlan laughed for a while. Then, he said in a softer voice, I believe you also know that I can't refuse my reward just now. Lu Chen nodded slightly. He didn't have any objection to this. As the leader of a powerful force, he could act arbitrarily and be domineering. However, he couldn't act recklessly when it came to rewards. No matter what he thought in private, Old Ma had given him such an important treasure. It was of great significance to Supreme Lord Tianlan. He might even be able to continue his secret plan without having to deal with another divine transformation stage perfected cultivator. This alone was worth the position of a deputy hall master in Fiyunji. But why? Supreme Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Chen with a faint smile. Did you fall out with Ma Xiaoyun recently? No. Lu Chen sighed and answered gloomily. Then, he asked himself in his heart, why is that? Chapter 643. From Lu Chen's point of view, no matter how he thought about it, he could not figure out why Old Ma would suddenly turn his back on him and stand on Shui Ying's side for no apparent reason. In fact, at this moment, his heart was filled with doubts. There were almost no emotions such as anger or even killing intent for revenge. If he had to list them himself, Lu Chen could tell Old Ma that he was stronger than Shui Ying and that his future prospects were better. At least 10 or 20 reasons would not be a problem. And Lu Chen himself believed that Old Ma was not a fool. He could see that true Lord Tianlan was cultivating Lu Chen as his successor, intentionally or unintentionally. In such a good situation, Old Ma had actually abandoned him, jumped off his ship, and boarded someone else's ship. There could only be one meaning, that guy did not seem to be optimistic about Lu Chen. Lu Chen knew Old Ma very well and trusted him very much. It could even be said that Old Ma was the person he trusted the most. So when this happened, although he did not show it on the surface, he was still surprised and a little suspicious about his situation. Could it be that he had overlooked something? Could it be that he had made a big mistake without knowing it? He shut himself in the quiet room and thought about it carefully for a while. He went through all the things that had happened during this period of time in his mind. In the end, Lu Chen found that although he had met a lot of people and things these days, and did not do everything perfectly, he basically did not make any mistakes. That would really be a ghost. After Lu Chen confirmed that there should be no major problems on his side, he began to doubt Old Ma's intelligence. Was that guy really stupid? For most people on Sky Dragon Mountain, Old Ma was not a person worth paying attention to. Even within Fiyunji, in the past, Old Ma was remembered as a person who followed behind Lu Chen all day long. He could be considered as one of the few subordinates of this true lord's successor. Lu Chen was in the limelight and his prestige was growing day by day, but Old Ma had always been very low-key. Almost no one could feel his existence. Because of this, Old Ma's switch did not cause too much of a stir in Zhengxianmeng and even in Fiyunji. Many people did not even know about it. However, within Fiyunji, especially within the small circle of the core, Old Ma's decision to jump ship was like a sudden clap of thunder, strongly stimulating a group of people. This meant a lot. First of all, Lu Chen's closest confidant had betrayed him. This must mean that there was something wrong with Lu Chen's current situation. Everyone could think of this. After all, even Lu Chen himself could not help thinking about it after knowing about Old Ma's action, to see if he had done anything wrong. In addition, there was another very important piece of news, which was that Lord Tianlan generously rewarded Old Ma with a position as the deputy chief of Fiyunji. Although the actual power of Old Ma had not been determined, this gesture had already explained a lot. Lord Tianlan actually approved of Old Ma's betrayal, even though he had jumped ship with Lord Tianlan's only disciple, Lu Chen. Did this mean that Lord Tianlan's attitude towards his disciple had also changed a little? Because the matter of the Tree of God's branch fragment was very important, it was not actually leaked out. Everyone only saw those superficial things. Whether it was Lord Tianlan, Lu Chen, Shui Ying, or even Old Ma himself, none of them would come forward to explain anything. Thus, amidst the flabbergasted cries, Lu Chen's originally great situation had inexplicably begun to show signs of being shaken by the wind and rain again. The Immortal City was the largest city in the world. It had a large population and was flourishing. Even at night, the lights at night were abnormally bright and beautiful, so much so that the night view of the Immortal City had also become a popular and famous scenery. The best place in the world to watch the night view of the immortal city was on Mount Celestial Dragon beside the immortal city. Every night when the moon was bright and the stars were sparse, standing on the high peak and looking down, one could see the huge city shrouded in the night sky. The lights were bright and dazzling, illuminating the night like the most precious jewels in the world, emitting a dazzling light that was intoxicating. There were not many people who could enjoy such a beautiful and rare scenery. Most of the time, only the people in Zhengxianmeng who occupied Mount Celestial Dragon had the right to do so. At the same time, some of the best scenic spots had long been occupied by the big shots in Zhengxianmeng, so there were not many good spots left to watch. Even if there were, it would be in some dangerous and high places that even cultivators did not like to go to. That night, Lu Chen brought Atu to a mountain peak that was deserted but had a good view. He brought some wine with him, and as he enjoyed the night view of the beautiful night view, he drank the wine. He looked very happy. The wind on the mountain was very strong, but the black dog did not respond to it at all. This dog's physique seemed to be rapidly evolving into the legendary divine beast. Even Lu Chen could feel the fierce undercurrent under the calmness. He thought that it was probably time for Atsu to return to the Great Snow Mountain soon. Vanity Fair. Lu Chen took a big gulp of wine and seemed to feel a little cold. He hugged Atsu and felt the warmth under the thick and soft fur. He rubbed his face comfortably and then murmured, "Atsu, do you know that below us is the world's biggest Vanity Fair?" Atsu looked back at him. Although this dog had become a little abnormal recently, it still did not seem to understand the word, Vanity Fair. Lu Chen did not bother to explain to it. He just stared at the lights at the foot of the mountain. After a while, he suddenly said, "In fact, I am almost the same as him. At the beginning, all I wanted was to survive. Later, the situation gradually changed, and I got more things. In the end, even the damn Baldy had to protect me and give me such a big piece of cake." He smiled slightly self-deprecatingly and said, "Atsu, do you like eating cake?" Woof. Atsu stared at Lu Chen and shook its head firmly and solemnly. It seemed a little afraid that its crafty master, Lu Chen, would replace the monster meat with cake in the future. Lu Chen rolled his eyes at it, spread out his hands, and said, "So now that I think about it, I can't blame old Ma, because in fact, even I have changed." He looked at the brightly lit city at the foot of the mountain and said, "Who doesn't want fame and fortune? It's good to have fame and fortune. If you can be a person above others, you can enjoy all the happiness in the world. Isn't this what people want in their life? Who is willing to follow behind others and be a minion for the rest of their life? Seeing that you have a bright future, do you want to be buried for the rest of your life?" "Why should I?" Lu Chen asked in a low voice. No one knew whether he was asking himself or Atsu, but Atsu did not seem to have any intention to answer. It raised its head and looked at the clear night sky. Suddenly, its eyes became serious, and it looked into the distance. Then, it suddenly shouted and roared. Lu Chen was shocked. He raised his head and looked in the direction that Atsu was looking at. In the distant sky, in the darkness of the night, a red light suddenly appeared.